I just want to welcome everybody to the AA, residents and guests and sort of semi-residents. I am Samantha Hardingham, Interim Director of the AA for this year, 17-18, and I'm really delighted to be able to host this event in what is really week one of teaching at the AA this year. And it's really very special because Hooke Park is a very special place and really far too far away from here. Although it's not very far away, as I keep reminding everybody, it's not that far. In fact, it's only down the road. But nevertheless, I have to say I was quite delighted by the description on the poster, which described Hooke Park as a woodland satellite, which I think is a kind of funny way of describing woodland. And I imagined it being something spinning around the AA, which it sort of does. It sort of spins around the AA, but actually what it does is something quite other. It's very much rooted to the ground, and it's all about the ground. So I quite like the notion that it's a satellite in that it is constantly altering itself and adjusting itself. That's the nature of woods. It's also the nature of the activities that are down there. For those of you who don't know, I'm scanning the audience for unfamiliar faces, but anyone who doesn't know, Hooke Park is our 350-acre woodland, which is very much a part of the AA estate. But because of its nature, very specific kinds of activities go on there, which I will not go into. That is the subject for this afternoon. But I just wanted to summarize, again, I'm kind of referring to the poster because I quite like the things that it missed off. And it's not by way of correction, it's just by way of expanding. It is the place where we fully engage with large-scale fabrication, craft, technology, and technology we mean literally everything from axes to robots, material behaviour, forestry and land, and I would say the imagination, I would add to that list. And a part of its role is to establish, or what it aims to do, I think, is to establish a symbiotic relationship between experimental architectural production and the forest surroundings. And I would also add to that, and people. It's part of the nature of buildings, maybe not always the nature of forests, but people tend to be involved in both of those. So I hope that's part of the subject of this afternoon. The other bit of my job is also to say really special thank yous to a few people, particularly in relation to the Wakeford Hall project, which is a lot of what we're going to see this afternoon, some of which I have to say. Michael Dixon, William Morwood, who are both here, who have just been incredible and incredibly generous with their time and expertise, in engineering expertise and architectural expertise, and also the Horace and Ellen Wakeford bequest, without which certainly many of the developments that have gone on in Hooke Park to date could not have happened without that very generous donation. So it's good to be reminded of that. And somebody else who should also be remembered today is Richard Burton, who died earlier this year, but was really the champion of Hooke Park, and I think, again, may come up in some of the history of the place, but really a figure very closely tied to the AA and somebody who, again, without whom Hooke Park probably wouldn't have got this far. We can argue whether it should have done or not later in the afternoon, I think. Which brings me to the point of conversations. Again, I'm just referring to the poster right now. It's called Conversations this afternoon. It's not a show. It is a show. It's a number of performances, I suppose, but performances in the nature of conversations in and around the work that's going on at Hooke. And I would, I would encourage you as an audience that you be part of those conversations. There is a tradition that is emerging, which has not always been the way. This room has witnessed conversations and debates and discussion. It has not really witnessed too much passive audience, non-participation. So I really would encourage that tradition remain or be enhanced, or maybe some would argue come back. So yes, these are conversations in front of you, but please please be a part of the conversation. This is the nature of what we do here. The architectural discipline is a discourse, so please be a part of that. On which note, I'm going to hand over to Martin Self, Director of Hooke Park, and Emmanuel Vercuz, who is co-director of Design and Make, who will carry you very effortlessly, I'm sure, through the afternoon. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming and participating today. Look forward to it. Good.
Thanks, Sam, for that info. Thanks, Manager, for helping us set this up. Thanks to all the students and everybody who's been involved in getting stuff here. And thanks mainly to all the speakers who are going to fill this afternoon with, I guess, provocations for the discussion. I think Sam's point is key. Like this layout, hopefully we can mess with a bit. Like the idea shouldn't be that it's an audience listening to conversations. It is, I guess, just by pairing a few people up to show the breadth of stuff that has been happening at Hooke and some speculation about things that are to come, projects and programs, some ideas and agendas for the future, that there can be an open, free discussion about that stuff. So the loose structure is kind of chronological, so a little bit of discussion of earlier projects from William and Chris. Nazomi is going to talk about her experience as the first Design and Make student, sharing about all the work that he's been doing there. He's probably the most present tutor over the years. And then we'll shift things a bit and perhaps have a bit of time at the back of the room talking about what Design and Make are up to on Wakeford Hall. Discussion from more recent visiting school work from Cleb and Jeroen. Bringing it back a little bit to Design and Make with Zach, talking about the wood chip barn project, and Kate talking about the proposition for the MA proposal. And then the idea is that as we go along, we should be having conversations and chats and kind of keeping it fluid and informal, hopefully keeping to the sort of half-hour timing of the handout. And then to end the day with, hopefully with a beer in our hand, an open discussion, which Mark Campbell will moderate. Also glad that Eddie from AA Lawn is here, so there's a discussion with David Green and Eddie about there being some engagement with that operation over the year with Hooke Park, which is maybe a nice way also of, I guess, injecting or cross-fertilising more ideas between this place and the place in Dorset over this coming year. And hopefully today is a sort of seed for some of that discussion. Okay, I was going to just, in probably, hopefully just 3 or 4 minutes, set a little bit of context of kind of where we're at and some of the prompts of ideas to come, and then Emmanuel will expand a bit more on some of the, I guess, particularly the sort of technological agenda that we've been pursuing, just to sort of frame things through that. And hopefully we can kind of broaden it right out to all the other discussions in the afternoon. That makes sense. So that's what the AA inherited. Excuse me. 2002. So a campus in the middle of a Dorset woodland, previously a furniture school. Most of you probably know the history. 3 amazing buildings which embodied a very particular agenda that had emerged from the collaboration between Fiotto, ABK, Richard Burton, and the client, I guess, John Makepeace, to use in a very kind of ambitious way the local material from the woodland, through kind of the technologies available in terms of design and making to deliver those exceptional kind of exemplar buildings that we live in every day, in the workshop. So that was then 2002. 15 years later, the AA has been expanding that campus, building new buildings, I guess particularly establishing an infrastructure for the kind of production of architecture, so the workspaces, the big shed and assembly workshop, some houses, so some accommodation, house for the caretaker's house, for the caretaker family, installing the boiler house, so a district heating system that means we can be self-sufficient, burning our own wood chip for the campus. So I suppose the facility as it stands, it can feed 40 or so, can sleep, I think it's about 25. Similar number in the workshop, a whole load of people perhaps in the woods, that kind of size of operation, between Chris and his chainsaw, Edward and the sawmill, Charlie in the workshop, a whole suit, we have a kiln that we can run, we can go from tree to building, and I guess that infrastructure is largely established. I guess we have the workspace, we have the machineries for that. I guess what we have at this moment, almost literally, with the first digger digging into the ground, is the start of, through the Wakeford Hall project, an opportunity to really expand the intellectual activity at Hooke Park from the driving ambition. The driving agenda has been, in a way, design through making, design and make. I guess the hope is with the Wakeford Hall project that we can really have a centre for a broadening of the agendas at Hooke. So that's kind of, in white, the original buildings, design and make stuff in purple. Orange, the footprints of all the possible parts of the outline permission to come. So they're kind of clustering in the middle of things that are becoming the Wakeford Hall, things to come along. Just to mention, I guess, second, I guess, of our amazing resources is the woodland itself. So, it's not usual for an architecture school to own 150 hectares of woodland. It's a mile north to south. Chris knows these woods very well. She and Zach, people do. There's lots of places I can still walk to and get lost in this woods. It's an amazing, rich and varied place. I guess 30,000 trees, this might correct me. 15 or more species, very mixed, very rich in its ecology, and it's just the depth of the consideration of its management. So there's I guess it's recognised in the designations it has, like it's recognised as ancient woodland, it's historically wooded, it's got that history, it's part of an area of outstanding natural beauty, which again is a kind of recognition of what's special about it. On its fringes are triple SI, sites of special scientific interest. We have an amazing resource there that we're barely tapping into beyond using it as a source of pieces of wood. So I think that's maybe a prompt for the discussion a bit, like how can we do more with this place? I guess our third resource is the team at Hooke Park, as well as inheriting trees and the campus and the buildings. Yes, Chris, Charlie and Georgie, their daughter Tia, they've all been inherited from the previous generation of activity at Hooke Park, and their knowledge and their understanding of that place is fundamental to how we run there. They form the soul of the place, really. Okay, so just a couple of slides prompting perhaps aspects of the future. So Wakeford Hall, let's just say, just to restate our kind of ongoing agenda, which I suppose is inherited from the visionary thinking of Fiota and the people involved early on, how we use our local material radically through technology, I think still kind of runs through day to day a lot of what we want to do. So rather than buying products from the other side of the world and sticking them in our buildings, how do we do something much smarter? So that agenda runs on. You'll pick a bit more of that up with what Emmanuel presents in terms of the technologies and the pursuit of some of those agendas. So that's the sort of given, I guess. We want to keep that activity going. I guess our big push is to build Wakeford Hall, not to rush it, to get it right. It's an amazing opportunity, through the generosity of the donor family, through the support of many people in this room. It's going to hopefully be an exceptional building and something that this place is proud of for many generations. It's going to give us a whole new kind of opportunity of doing things at Hooke Park. So I think this was the moment when the digger touched the ground and started the project on the site. So far there's just a hole in the ground, a couple of piles, and a whole load of thinking and models and prototypes that are emerging, which we'll hear about later from the students. Just to crudely superimpose the planning drawing. So I guess we're going to gain a few things as a kind of academic facility. We'll have a space very similar to this to host a whole lot of things we just can't do at the moment. So symposia, lectures, just day to day to have a multi-purpose, quiet, big space as a facility. Flanking that on one side, a library. So again, a quiet study space, somewhere to have the archive of all the historic material and our own book collection. So a space of proper thinking academically without the sound of a planer in the background. And then I guess to the other side, so moving some of the office facility over there, giving a kind of more professional space for that, and very critically a reception point. So I guess tied in with ideas on the landscaping, which will emerge as well, to actually give a point of arrival and a sense of a centre for the campus. So tied in with an ongoing development of the landscape, of how we're using the green fingers through the site. You know, stitching things together, what is at the moment a bit of a wasteland, I guess, in the middle of the yard there, you know, the next few years turning into something that really properly represents the AA as its satellite in Dorset. So that's Wakeford Hall. Something which we've been talking about is kind of in the background, but I think very, very fundamental to the long term of Hooke Park is we're not just hermetically working in our island, you know, within the trees in the middle of this place. Like West Dorset is an amazing place. The coastline is amazing. You know, it's a World Heritage Site. It's a very rich place in terms of, I guess, attitude to the land, culturally interesting. You know, it's still connected to London, but it's kind of far enough away to be something else. There's places like Portland down the road, which are almost the opposite of Hooke Park, but an amazing kind of bit of geography. So there's a richness around Hooke Park that, again, my sense is we're not fully exploiting. So opportunities, again, it's a sort of provocation almost back to the AA as a whole. How do we work with that? I suppose very directly with design and make. Ultimately, we're going to finish our campus. You know, we'll be looking for opportunities to carry on that premise of students designing and building permanent buildings. So to be able to do that, you know, design and fabricate things at Hooke Park, to still do the technical research, but to take that out to clients off-site is a really key, you know, really key agenda for us, that we're planting seeds now, hopefully that will bear fruit in a few years' time. There's a whole talk in that, but I think there's some interesting potential there. Clem's presentation will be a flavour of the potential of that, because she started a summer school this year, which is working with an organisation, the Kingham Wildlife Centre, which is off-site and gives an opportunity to test how we start doing those kind of projects. This was, the working with the client, wasn't it? Walking around the site of the Kingham Centre. So, you know, there are fields as well as woods in West Dorset and some towns. And I guess the third of these just kind of prompts to sort of frame some of the stuff we're talking about. So I guess, as I said before, you know, we have these trees, we have this piece of geography which is amazing, but there's a cultural opportunity that it feels like we're not fully exploiting. You know, we do build follies in the woods, we kind of do that kind of thing. You know, students go out there, they enjoy that space, but to really have high-level, critical, you know, intellectual agenda that's engaging with what it means to work in a rural context as well as an urban one seems like a seriously important, you know, agenda provocation for this school. I guess one of the things which will inform that will be Kate's presentation, anticipating the development of the MA that she's proposing, looking at land and art and practice that's, you know, located in the woods much more intimately than we are doing to date. And that's pretty much it. I guess that will form what we're kind of looking for in terms of the resident programmes as a kind of triumvirate of MArch, you know, architecture students focusing on delivering, you know, permanent buildings, MSCs working alongside them on more explicit technical explorations, and the MA focusing more on that broader cultural dimension in the woods themselves. Okay, that's that stuff. Over to Emmanuel.
Thanks. So Martin gave us the larger picture of kind of Hooke Park and design and make, and I thought I'd focus in on an attitude and a perspective on technology, and I think this quote's really crucial from that perspective. We don't look at technology as an assembly of just machines, but we look at it as a device for altering the world and the way that we engage with the landscape and our immediate surroundings. And in a way, there's a pinnacle, a certain focus. Kind of once a year we look at integrating of a new tool or the invention of a new tool, and we kind of test that and run that through a visiting school called Robotic Fabrications. And kind of the side effect of these robotic fabrications is the building of the foundry building. So I thought this was quite an adept quote saying that if you want to kind of be in control of the future, we want to get hands-on and we want to get our hands dirty. So in robotic fabrications, we look at the integration of tools which might be borrowed from the world of forestry. So a tool like a chainsaw isn't exactly known for its exactitude or control, but once we attach it to a robot, we're actually, we do give it a new dimension. So it means we can start operating really precisely on natural geometries. So besides getting hands-on with the technology and with the material, it also changes our perspective on the way that we manufacture things. It becomes a space of performance. It becomes a choreographed activity. And besides that, we let the tool help us and inform our designs. Like the nature of a chainsaw, it wants to cut planar, so that's perfect to use in the translation of Japanese joints. These are some of the outcomes of those pieces. We do some proper testing and then proper load testing. So this is the result of 10 days of intense kind of prototyping. And we'll use technology to investigate and kind of question what we do. So this is obviously the real space. So through photogrammetry, we construct it digitally so we can interrogate it further, and then we could look at the second phase of additions. I have to acknowledge that although I run the visiting school, this is a team effort. So there's no way we could achieve any of this without the ingenious tooling of Charlie and our roboteers that help us write the scripts and the code. So this year we integrated the bandsaw with the ambition to integrate it and use it for the development of the Wakeford Hall. So again, we're not consuming huge budgets. We are really tapping into the creative genius of Charlie that takes about an existing bandsaw and magically attaches it to a robot. So these are some images of the early kind of testing, and just for us to find out how this tool will behave. So again, this is 10 days, 10 pieces, with a really kind of complex nature. So we're investigating the world of bespoke glue lamp that we then put in front of the robot and do really localized, precise operations where a junction or a connection wants to take place. We also want to reinforce the idea that the piece doesn't leave the robot cell as a finished article. There is a real engagement and a tacit knowledge required to finish these pieces. But it allows us to set up operations that look into surface treatment. So this is a kind of endless repeated geometry will give us really quite fantastic surface detail to some of the beams. And this was 10 days and 10 components machine. So that was it for me, thanks.
basically very, very privileged to have these two guys in our worlds down at Hooke. William's been visiting on a kind of roughly fortnightly basis, supporting the development of the Wakeford Hall project. You'll see why in a minute. He's such an exceptional person in the mix. He's basically the prototype design and make student. So I've stolen your line. You were going to say that. I got in there first. You'll understand why why we say that. So architect and builder, basically, and yeah, you'll hear all about it in a minute. Chris, a lot of you all know, is our forester. He's been involved in the woods quite a long time, knows the trees well. There's trees that he planted that are now big, mature, amazing. The redwoods, the biggest trees now, are they the ones you planted? It's just, but anyway, the depth of knowledge that Chris has and the passion for the woodland is amazing. So getting these two guys to talk a little bit, I guess, through the prototype house project and what that opens out in terms of back in the 1980s, the relationship between the trees and the building, hopefully what we can then discuss around.
All right, okay, fantastic. Right, this is what, yeah, thank you for asking me to come here, because it's very, yeah, it's great to be involved again. And for those of you who've been to Hooke, this is what the wood looked like in my day behind what is now the refectory. And I know it's changed a lot since then. And it's interesting to sort of reflect on how it all started, which is slightly unusual. And this guy, John Makepeace, had a furniture school in Parnham, in a fantastic house there. And he came up with this idea that you could use forest thinnings and generate a sort of income from the forestry process. And this was partly because he managed to get hold of Hooke Park. And then he thought, you know, I need to have some buildings for this school, which would be called the School for New Woodland Industries. And he needed to get a design team involved, which, and there was no sort of messing about with it, which is great, because he went off to see Ted Happold in Bath and Bureau Happold, and that got Ted Happold involved, and also Michael Dixon involved, who continues to be involved to this day, and also fantastically involved Fry Otto, the sort of great German engineer of the 20th century, who's, you know, fantastic ability with lightweight structures, which really brought a sort of extra dynamic to the team. And only at this point, having got, you know, the engineers, that it was also explained to Makepeace, you do need an architect, which, and to this end, because there was already a contact with ABK and Richard Burton, ABK got the job, and Richard Burton was, you know, involved right from the very beginning, and this team put together a master plan. And what you can see on the right is the three little buildings together, and the first one is what is now the refectory building, which we call the prototype. And then to the left of that is the workshop building, which got built, and then a sort of big central space. So this was sort of the master plan and the first conception to how the whole sort of school could be put together. And the first part of this was to build a prototype house. And I was working at ABK at the time, got the job as project architect, which was, again, fantastic fun. And this is what the site looked like where the refectory now is. And this is when it was first cleared to build the house. And these were sort of sketch drawings or sort of diagrammatic drawings which showed how the section was put together. And part of the whole sort of process was we didn't exactly have an open hand, but we needed to use timber which came out of the forest as part of the thinning process, and that led us to certain timber sizes which then could be used in different ways. And it was like you had to make use of the timber and the timber we had to come up with a design, which was how the sort of section of the house came together, and I'll explain a bit more of that later. And that's how the sort of diagram of the house and how all the black members are all in compression, and then with the rafters acting in tension. And also, there's a lot of discussion about how to hang the rafters at one end, and there was, you know, how do you actually grab a piece of timber with a 50mm diameter under quite a lot of tension securely, and there was lots of discussions. And in fact, Richard Burton used to tell a wonderful story about Fry Otto and Ted Happold having an argument from a hotel bedroom down to a car park at 2 o'clock in the morning about how to put the resin joint together. And maybe Michael was here to remember that, but I wasn't involved at the time. Anyway, we did come up with the idea of using the resin joint as being the most efficient way of doing it. And this was, and then the thing happened, having done all these drawings, and I tried to find a contractor to build the project, and they were all a bit scared about all this stuff and couldn't find anything. And then out of a conversation with Richard one day, we were sort of saying, how do we do it? And I said, well, I can build a house for you. And he goes, thank you, you better go off and do it. And that's how it sort of happened as quickly as that. And so then we went down to the forest and started making all the components. First, making all the drilling the holes for the resin joints, and then getting these the threaded rods in it. And this is me in my younger days. This is, as Martin says, this is the prototype design and make person, making all the resin joints up, because I had some carpenters working with me who were really good at all the carpentry stuff. But in those days, epoxy resin was all a bit too new for them and a bit controversial. So I made all the joints up, and they did all the carpentry. And then we got on site and started putting the frame together. And this is an aerial view of the frame before any of the rafters got put in place. And I think at this point, I'll ask Chris to say a little bit, because basically all these timbers all came out of the thinning process, and those larger timbers there were the sort of the final piece of timber which came out of the thinning process, and the rafters sort of came earlier in the thinning process. And what was important as part of the design team involved not just Chris, a guy called Andy Poor in those days, who was the chief forester, and Chris was working with him. And they basically told us as a design team what we could have, and we then had to moderate the design to suit the information they gave us. And I'll just show you one. There's one more of the frame. And that's the rafters being put in place before they were tied down. But I'll just let Chris say a bit about how we work together.
Yeah, hi. So I was part of the forest team under the head forester at the time, Andrew Paul, and we were tasked with carrying out 3 operations to supply the building team with the timbers. The first one was having a conversation with the architects and engineers, and what impressed us as foresters was almost the naivety of the architects and engineers for 2 reasons: not appreciating the inherent strength of timber in the round, and also the design of trees. On the point of design of trees, engineers and architects, even now I suspect, think a tree grows as a cylinder. But in fact, a tree starts big on the ground and disappears to nothing at all when it reaches 30-40 meters. So there was a bit of an education there. On the strength side of things, there were many times when we were telling the engineers and architects, hold on a minute, you're wanting a piece of timber that's 600 mil at the big end, and you want a 6 meter length. It's going to be vast and huge. So let's rethink it. So there was a lot of toing and froing on that. So that was task number 1, which was quite an effort, but we won. Task number 2, we both won, both teams won. Task number 2 was the finding of the trees. So that in itself was a task. It was probably over, a year or so?
Yeah.
Preparation, right. Where we had, or Andrew Poor had earmarked stands of trees where thinning was required. In other words, giving trees more space, the better trees more space to go on. So we went in, thinned, the trees were marked, the ones to come out. So at this stage, we weren't thinning necessarily for the building, but we anticipated that every 5th or 4th tree would have a component for the building. And that's what we did. We must have felled, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 trees. And then it was a case of looking at each tree by the track. It was a long cutting list, again created by both parties. And we spent ages going backwards and forwards with tape measures, calipers, spending half an hour on a single component to try and get the correct diameter, both at the big end and the small end. We did ask for tolerances, otherwise we wouldn't move the thing forward. So anyway, we reached the point where we had sufficient number of trees or components to then go to phase 3, which was the treatment of the timbers. Two sorts of treatments the timbers were exposed to. In the photograph, there are 4 A-frames. And I think they're very obvious. The one nearest to us is, they were from a coarse pine. And because the A-frame, the bottom of the A-frames had to go into the ground, they were exposed to different treatment which we couldn't do in-house, so we had to send them away. All the other elements of the building were treated in-house by us, by the forestry team, using boron salts, which is quite a common way of treating timber that's not going to be exposed to any sort of outside elements like rain and so on, okay, because it leaches out very fast. So really that was our task. It was a treatment that probably took us the longest time because it was a case of building a large bath, about 7 meters long, 3 meters wide, mixing up a solution to the right portions, and then literally dunking each component 2 or 3 at a time in the bath, taking them out, and then re-dunking them the following day, and then enclosing, making heaps of these treated timbers, enclosing them in a big blanket of polythene, and where they would stay for 6 weeks, enclosed in this sealed unit for the treatment to be allowed to work. Because it's a diffusion process whereby the chemical is absorbed into the timber, almost to the core.
Fantastic. Also, so having seen your manuals thing about robotics, the kit you have there is just so much better than we have. It's just simple chainsaws and things, but yeah, it's quite enviable what's down there at the moment. And this was just testing the rafters hanging from a cable, and then because we wanted to, there was always a possibility, but once the rafters got loaded up with the weight of the roof, you could have a failure. So we tied them all down so they would take up the deflection which would take place once the dead load of the insulation was put in place. And I think they all worked actually, so it was fine. But it was a sort of prudent thing to do. And that's just a photograph of some of the compression joints as well, which also used epoxy resin. So it's a really simple way of putting things together.
If you want to show this and explain.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, the theory, and Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically the whole the theory about the joint is that because a tree grows in a sort of linear fashion and all the capillaries run down through the tree, if you then have a V-shaped joint and you pour epoxy resin into that V-shaped joint, the resin then connects with every strand within the timber. So it became an incredibly efficient way to do it. And I believe that later on someone actually got a V-shaped drill bit, but we used these step drill bits and then had 2 little holes in the top here, and when you filled one with resin and the resin came out of the other, you knew you've got a secure joint and the hole was full of resin. And they have proved to be fantastically durable. So, and it was all a bit of a learning curve. And again, Chris and Andy and the team were, invaluable to this process.
Explain the sort of, so there there was a problem to start with, which is relevant. Yeah, there was a problem to start with about these joints, which is relevant to what Jack and his team are trying to do today, is that several sections with the piece of studding were sent away for testing to see how strong it was in the sort of pull-out action. And they were failing very quickly, and nobody could work out what was going on. But it turned out that it was actually a very simple solution, is that when the tapered holes were formed, we weren't clinical enough in cleaning out the tapered hole, so the glue wasn't allowed to filtrate into the fibres. There was too much dust still on the outside or the inside of the hole walls. So it was a case of just putting a vacuum cleaner nozzle down each hole every time one had been repaired, and that did the job. More sections were sent away, and they only failed at, I think, 6 tons pull out, which is quite a lot.
Good, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. But then, having got the roof on, boarded, the ends of the prototype house are boarded, and in fact that used the biggest sections of timber from the forest just to get planks, because the round was so much more efficient. And then the rafters are all in tension, the boards put over the top, and then insulation on top of that, and then a cylinder membrane put over the top of it. And this is what it looks like after I first finished it.
Yeah, and the timber, apart from the A-frames of timber, the rest of the building is Norway spruce. So, your conventional Christmas tree. The only thing that had to be imported are the window frames, all that framing. Western red cedar from probably, the western seaboard of the United States.
And that's how it is. It's a bit different now because the forest has changed a bit. That's how it is when I left it first. And I think, still going on. All right, and this is and then the next step after that, having built the house, was to build the workshop, which used a lot of the same philosophy, but then used some of the larger timbers and then bent them to make the arch form. And that is, the workshop as it now is. And again, this was all done with the same design team. Yeah.
So again, this is where the engineers and the architects were being sort of bloody minded, if you want. So we have the roof elements which are forming, or trying to form an arch. So originally what they did is they took 2 trees 11 metres long, and they brought them together, having anchored them to the ground, but they weren't happy. It was a pointed arch. So you have 2 10-metre poles coming up, and then being attached between the 2 is a noggin, is that what it's called? Some flattened piece of wood to give a better arch. The other thing to say, again, the architects, engineers being as they are, is that they were speccing these bendable components, 11-metre trees we had to pull out in one section, which is a task in itself, and they were sort of over-speccing by 450 mil at the base, and we were telling them, you'll never bend anything like that. So these are actually very much smaller than what was originally specced. And the final thing to say on this is that we invested, we had to take the bark off all these components in order for the treatment to get in to the timber. And we bought a fairly expensive machine to debark the timber, to take the bark off the tree. And so we had produced about 150 of these. But the trouble is the finish was not good enough for the engineers. And they only told us this when we had done 150. So we had to, would you believe it? We rejected all those 150 and we had to start all over again. And this time round, the timbers were hand debarked. by yours truly here. So.
I wasn't there, that wouldn't have happened if I'd been here, sure. But yeah, the workshop was there, and it's and then the other building, which was built in the sort of Makepeace area, was Westminster Lodge, which Ted Cullinan was the architect, but not ABK, but still the same engineering team. And that was the frame of Westminster Lodge going up. And that comes to the end of sort of like phase one of Hooke Park, because after Makepeace couldn't make a go of the furniture school, and then basically through Richard Burton's intervention and connections with the AA took over, which is just fantastic. So yeah, thank you.
William and Chris have wandered off stage. I was going to ask if there's any immediate questions.
I forgot
if there's any. No one's throwing their hands up.
So the original workshop was the one for the furniture, is that right? Or?
No, Makepeace had a furniture school in Park House.
Right, we could use the mic. So.
Yeah. John Makepeace had a furniture school in Farnham House, just outside on the edge of Bearminster.
Oh, I see.
And in fact, Richard Burton's sons had gone to the furniture school, so that's how the ABK connection came. And then he wanted to set up a school that basically used, forest products.
Yeah. But that original building that you showed us was for the AA.
No, everything I talked about was specifically for Makepeace.
Right.
And the workshop building, and I know he has some angst about the timber sizes, came out of a sort of specific brief from Makepeace about the size of workshop he wanted and the size of machinery which went in. So that's what sort of drove the whole dimensions for the floor height, the sort of ceiling height of the workshop and the space involved.
You guys have been. Yeah. So if there's other questions, let's store them up, and in the later conversation we can bring them back up. Okay, so for the second conversation, introduce Nozomi Nakabayashi and Shin Egashira. Nozomi was the first actual Design and Make student. So she joined in 2010, joined the program as a sole Design and Make student working alongside a diploma unit, so a group of 7 or 8, I guess, overall. Hopefully Nozomi will present the experience at Hooke Park and maybe how that's informed things since. And then Shin, I think, is probably maybe the first tutor to go to Hooke Park. Certainly the sort of pioneer AA tutor taking students out, getting to understand the place, getting to understand Charlie and Georgie and Chris, and understanding how to work out there. So in a way, Shin's model for how to bring educational programs into the wood has been, I guess, an inspiration for visits and units and everybody since. So hopefully between those two presentations, get a really nice sense of sort of trajectory of work at Hooke Park.
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of start from a question I ended up with at the end of the course, maybe. Yes, I was the first student of Design and Make. the projects that Design and Make took on at the time was the Big Shed, which is the assembly workshop. And after going through the program, sort of what I came to feel is that the story we tell as an architect is a bit of a fiction. And so this is us imagining the Big Shed in the beginning. It's probably about, April 2011 or so. You can see the site being flattened in the background. And then the other question I started thinking about, I suppose, was what do we mean by design and make? And I guess in my head, design is a bit of a fiction. And then, so here we are assembling the truss. So the building itself consists of 8 trusses that are sort of more or less parallel. And again, the starting point of the design was to make use of the small diameter roundwood timber as a continuation of the earlier projects. And the design manifested itself through large spanning trusses. And then the making, maybe you can paraphrase that as a realization perhaps. And then this is the interior photo of the Big Shed, which I'm sure a lot of you have been there. And I guess then if we say that design is fiction and the making is realization, like what are those two things? So this is a typical sort of Gantt chart, which I guess if you're in the office you're quite familiar with. And then I just kind of looked at that as the tool in which architects try to describe building projects from beginning to end. But clearly it's a bit of a fiction because I started to say, okay, if there's a certain conventional tool in understanding a building process, what does it mean for like a design and make building process? So as a part of my thesis, I tried to kind of make design and make Gantt chart or something. So from the beginning, really thinking about what inspired the design. So obviously the physical building experience on site, and the other thing that's unique to design and make is that you actually live on site, and how those two things start to inform the building shape. And then this is a bit of a zoom in into part of that map / Gantt chart. And what we started to realize is that there's a lot of loop in the design processes, which is to do with, I guess, figuring out, testing the unknowns, perhaps. And in this case, it was the connection detail of the truss connecting on. So the trusses are connected, mainly the top chord and the braces are connected with a series of Hooke screws. So this was a way to, I guess, minimize use of steel, but at the same time to make the manufacturing process more hands-on. And again, the drawing of the truss as we imagined. And the other sort of emerging question was that, what does a drawing in the design and make process mean, perhaps? And so this is showing the truss geometry and then the top of the joist geometry, which then dictated the main facet geometry of the cladding. And what we realized is that what we tend to ignore is the variability of the natural material. So in this case, we had a specific diameter requirement from the structural engineer for what the chords needed to be, but obviously from the conversation of the previous presenter, we know that the timber varies in size, and quite a bit of thought went into how do you achieve multifaceted geometry through something that is inherently varied. So that's a section through the top chord. And that's a joint and showing the top chord backing rafter that goes in parallel to the round wood. So you can see here the center line mark for the truss, which is what we extracted from the 3D model, and then we take in any diameter variance of the top chord member through having the packer, so the offset to the top of the backing rafter remains constant. So then kind of sketching a little bit, thinking through, what was the contingent zone of the construction perhaps. And then I thought a bit more about, okay, so if there's the drawing, which is, that in a simplest form, and then there's the making, what is the sort of appropriate drawing medium in the making? And I started thinking a bit more about the role of sketching in this context, which was largely inspired by, working directly with the contractor and the builders on site. And you start to notice that, the drawing package as we deliver professionally isn't comprehensive of what happens on site. So, for instance, this one is a drawing of Charlie Bretnell trying to figure out how the raising sequence for the truss might happen. So at that point, you go into a territory of, what spaces are available on site, what is the reach of the crane, all of those things, which at the time for me was something I never really encountered in a normal architectural practices. So here is the truss A, the very first truss being lifted off the crane. It's probably Jack. Yeah, that guy in the red jacket is Jack Draper. Yeah. And then I guess I started sort of sketching what happens on site, which is something that never really gets documented in a normal construction set per se, because your involvement as an architect obviously kind of ends when you hand off the building package. And then I kind of went back again to this question of, what are we producing as an architect to the world in order so that something can be built? And if we are saying that that is not comprehensive, or it's actually sometimes a flat out lie, or we just sort of lying our way through. And after finishing the Big Shed project, and graduating, just one very small project came through, actually through Charlie. Because one of Charlie's friends who lived nearby wanted to build a very small structure for him nearby Hooke Park. So then I said, along with my colleague Elizabeth, let's try and build something. So this is us sort of sketching in the beginning what the structure could be. It's a very small hut, sort of 2.5 meter in its footprint. And maybe I speak a little bit about mistakes I've made, because often you learn from the mistakes. So the project took probably too long for what it's worth, and thank you for Hooke Park for sort of letting me stay for a long time working on these things. I started off by actually just building the roof frame without really knowing what the entirety of the structure was. So And then obviously quite excited about building, ordered the timber, just started building the roof. And if you go back to the initial sketch, you can kind of get a sense that it's actually floating in the air, which we didn't really know how that was going to work. So after building the roof frame, we were like, okay, yeah, actually we need to hang the stuff or let it float. And then the reality check of cost and weight in this case sort of hit us. And it was going to be 3 tons. And the other thing was, can we actually bring the thing to site? So a lot of these, I guess, practical questions that we should have asked, we never did. And the other thing that was, I guess, a bit about how processes of sequence work, and foundation, frame, roof, exterior cladding, interior, that's sort of like a typical progression of how a building is built. In that particular project's case, I built the roof. I did that's a mock-up, tried to float it somehow, and did the interior finish of the ceiling before even really knowing where it was going. And then there we are, raising the structure with the maximum weight that it could with the very low telehandler, and operated by and then here's us sort of finishing the roof structure. Again, a bit of a mistake in that wanted to do a roof in cork, but it started leaking, so I had to cut it at the end. And a bit of drawing of how the whole process worked at the end. So, yeah. Yeah, that's it.
Same as the sun, I just lost my voice, so I may end up speaking quite soft, and then I increase number of slides, so I don't have to speak much actually. Yeah, I have in my computer hard drive, I have a huge stack of a file called Hooke. I just suddenly realized that there is I've been involved in this Hooke Park for quite a long time actually. Then this is one of the images which first year students actually made a kind of reading room in Hooke Park, which is early 2000 actually. So my involvement with Hooke Park is as a tutor who initially started bringing students as a part of the project assignment, then involved with also Maeda Hooke Park workshop, which bring lots of students from different parts of the school work together. So several times or once or twice a year. Currently also I'm teaching diploma unit, so we do occasional workshop session in Hooke Park. So I think to me the workshop is a kind of place, Hooke Park is a place where you bring some difficult tasks and it's work with kind of unsettling feeling of, well, can we do this or not? Then we set up certain tasks and just explore and see what's happened. So in that sense, probably quite amazing testing ground. So one is about full-scale operation. Other one is probably amount of space and time and concentration we could have compared to the Bedford Square. It's quite luxurious. This is 2003. Amanda and Jesse Young when they were first year students, so they made some kind of student boxing machine, and they have to exercise punching each other without actually punching them somehow. It's kind of educational materials actually. I think I'm gonna skip that, but there's my diploma student making some weird details and of their projects. 2010. It's already. So I think also scale itself is 1 to 1, 1 to 5, 1 to 20 abstract scale and testing with materiality, which is actually we can conduct all those investigation and experiments in parallel to one another, which is quite excellent, I think. Then this is twisting concrete minor workshops. I just show one another example. This time we combine research cluster, minor sponsor, minor corporation from Tokyo construction company and architect's office, which actually has been very generous to also the cultural activity at the AA. So we started this new minor series in Hooke Park. So basically, original ideas actually came from when I was collaborating with David Green on the project, which took some his initial project, mosque project when he did it with students, and we are meant to revisit the project and try to reinterpret and see how actually his building can be built. So along this conversation, this idea of minimum surface and stretched fabric and geometry, this kind of things came out, so become a seed of investigation. So these are basic diagram. And basically when you make one continuous cut, then stretch the stocking over it, and you try to measure its minimum surface and how that property could actually see in structural work. So the segment and cut. Then also, also full model scale. At the same time, we worked along with the students from DLL, looking at all those how to articulate minimum surface from 3D model as well. So when you click that, I think there's something. Something is going to happen that one will sound this. See? So we do kind of parallel thing, the 3D model and actual model, and one-to-one and non-scale. Then mapping all those differences. So this is kind of one of the most detailed is a concrete cassette over stretched fabric, and try to see the difference between 3D models, the computer articulated surface, and actual materials and thickness. I don't know why we are doing it, but we thought it's quite exciting to make certain comparison about weight and thickness and material behavior. This is another test. Different samples, mixture of fiberglass and resin achieve the thickness and density differentiated by different aggregated combined together. First iteration is about furniture, so we play with those formwork and multiply them. Then mapping, documenting all those formwork which laid out in front of the workshop space. Second, again, we just interested in extending this technique even a bit further to make some components. So CNC machine, we estimated if there is 6 different cut pattern to be able to make 16 different cube, which are also, as long as sections be mirrored, then you could actually continuously build up the surface from it. The landscape made by formwork, process of casting, and then stitching them back together. Wall unit has been existed for 3 years in a dining room. Now it's become a bit of, this is a cow, a cow skin, in a small scale like it fit in the hand. Then enlarge them bigger, stitch them together, and stretch, and hard cast plaster and render, open cast and become cow. So this is quite furniture pieces. I think we continue doing that in Hooke Park through the whole season. We start to manage, create some kind of strange animals across the park. then twisting one, again, a bit more challenging geometry, which are inside out, continuous surface, flipping inside out structure, metal work, segment together. So this time the pipe work become integral part of the reinforcement. So back to the furniture and the piece. So then I think these are kind of experimental work, which is basically simply materials we already know about, or we think we already know about, but try to test the limit of it in terms of shapes and procedures and materialities. Then I think next phase of the Hooke Park, we were actually begin having conversation with the master plan of Hooke Park, in which if we do some sort of different type of work which responding to how master plan progress, but we finding some sort of missing link in between the phase or space in between the buildings. Also how we could actually complement by conducting some workshop. So first things we did is the wood shop produced lots of wood cut. Then also some of Italian students thought it may be good to make pizza oven. So we can actually use sustainable in terms of wood work and creating workshop. And then we could have also self-catering unit outside. So digging out the clay from the site and try to find a way to build. So this is the one in the first session park of my workshop, we built pizza oven. And then rammed earth floor in relationship to oven. And I remember Georgie, I think Georgie, not Charlie, Georgie was so excited, saying, "Oh, it's the first time in the Hooke Park somebody made something really practical." So I'm not so sure that was a very compliment. I should take a compliment or not. Anyway, but still in use, I think. And then made ceiling wood as a roof, stretched over, covering up and make outside dining space. And then following that, I think we involved in the replacement of Andrew Goldsworthy's gate. The opportunity was we thought might be interesting to call the gateway. And then objective might be to how to interlink from the gate to the new Wakeford building when it's complete. How we can walk through the woods and reaching not along the asphalted road, but maybe some passage in the woodland can be established over a period of time. So, yeah. So we did the start mapping of the ground materials along potential footpaths. And then again, topsoil to clay and mixture, and compress them to see what kind of material performance or potential they have when you use them as ground materials as well as render materials. And vegetation, some sections, and tree and branch. How each tree can have some sort of interesting geometry already exists in the branching point. Then first thing we built was the actual replacement of the gate. It is about very swinging, point balanced, rotating gate. It's not about shape, but this one is about how to really finding center of the mass to actually accurately balance them. So again, we calculated certain things and moves and flows there. And then knocking down the unequal piece, being quite rotten, so it's become structurally impossible to keep standing. So what we did is take them apart, then stretch the visual line from the gate towards our new building we built in 3 years' time, then distribute those pieces along the footpath. So become kind of graveyard. I said eventually it might be, hopefully that's going to become kind of a footpath leading to places. Then we make a kind of team to map, at the same time team to comes with what leading from the gate into next gateway. So these are construction which we have just finished this early August, I think. So echoing those lines from thinking between those footpaths and the front gate, stretched out, 2 oak trees being cut with crease, and branches being chopped off and keep as much piece as possible to form the platform. Actually. So it's not for the bicycle. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so just to recap, so thanks Gina and Nozomi, really amazing to hear the work presented again. I should maybe just state, Nozomi did not really explain just how much of her mind and body she put into that project, the Hat on Stilts thing. It was an absolute labour of love through the winter on her own, passionately kind of, well, occasionally persuading other people to help, but basically taking that thing, you know, all the way through to its amazingly perfected completion. So just to kind of add a little bit to what she was saying there. So the plan now is as tutors, Simone and I will just give a bit of the background to the Wakeford Hall project. And then the idea is that we'll, I guess, swivel around, maybe kind of leave some of these seats and gather at the back of the room, and the students will present. I suppose the idea is that it's a snapshot of the work that they're up to at the moment, so kind of around the model and work that's on the wall there, to give a sense of where we're at with Wakeford Hall this week.
We thought it's so much more interesting to look at the physical pieces in front of us rather than look at GAs and drawings or digital models or slideshows that quickly disappear. So we can kind of have a nice conversation, kind of looking at the beautiful part of the model back and the drawings.
And then after that we'll have a little coffee break, so maybe we can kind of stay down that end of the room as well and keep a conversation going with the students there, and then pick up the part 2 up here. So I think just very briefly, I'll give a little bit of some prehistory on the Wakeford project. Emmanuel will maybe pick up and just bring, I suppose just because this project's happening in phases, should just explain the background of where we are. So I guess the premise of Wakeford Hall, the brief was in the outline master plan that was drawn up initially in the strategic plan 2008, in the planning permission that came through, the outline permission 2010, the idea of more study space, lecture space, a bit of library space, those things kind of got clustered together to be one key building, the academic centre for the campus. The very first act was to hold an AA community-wide open ideas competition, so seeking a breadth of input from the school community as a whole. So that was, the idea was there not to seek a singular design, but to seek strategies, a bunch of ideas that could feed into this project. So we had lots of very interesting entries, 2 winners and 2 runners-up, which maybe a couple of them are here, from which the students were then able to formulate their response to the project. So I was captured there, seeking wild design ideas, radical tactics, looking for strategies and ideas to feed into what this project would be. Position of the site, loosely, so on the southeast corner of the big open yard, to basically be the heart of the campus and the kind of natural arrival point when you come in from the road, sort of from the top right hand. So the two of the winning ideas, their boards. So there's a period of the cohort. So this was beginning of last year, so early 2016, the competition entries feeding into the initial brief of the design and make cohort. Basically through, I suppose, February, March of 2016, extracting these ideas, doing a lot of research into the history of the master plan of the site, not just the AA's master plan from 2010, but the very early ones, the one that William showed from ABK, and actually subsequent ones through the era of the Parnham buildings. I guess that had fed into then both the kind of understanding globally of where the sort of brief was leading them in terms of the programmatic needs for the project, and then within the design and make program, very explicitly some processes of building up through prototyping, through making, and understanding what the project could be.
So we thought it was really important to interrogate the winning proposals and to really start experimenting through prototyping and starting to build large-scale versions of some of the key ideas. So some of that involved aluminium casting straight into timber to form the connections, steam bending a whole tree for structural kind of components, and film, as you might have noticed, is quite an important medium for us. So the students put this beautiful film together. If I could find a play button. That really talks through the whole process and all the components. sort of a roof, and hopefully we're looking into applying this methodology for the roof of the Wakeford Hall. So starting this year, or actually last year, really, looking into Act 2 Wakeford Hall, the students looked into the global design. So the structural logic is to have these two skeletons. One forms the library and the other one forms the offices, and the roof is tension in between those rigid structures. So this is the amazing job that these guys did in putting together all the documents to take it through planning permission, so, and doing the initial landscaping around it. And as I said, coming up with the global design for the building, although they are looking into building a component of it, it was important to try and approach this through a global, trying to solve the building logic of the global structure. So the guys are going to take you through the library structure and all of the drawings kind of behind you, but I just thought it's important to provide a little bit of background knowledge. So we looked into the development of skeletons and structural frames. So we looked at that initially as wide as possible, so kind of from futuristic to a bit more retro kind of framework. So from a prototype car to a timber frame model. I'm sure William will be able to tell you which one that is, but I can't. But also looking at furniture, like Carlo Molino's fantastic structure of his tables, or Michelucci's amazing cathedral of the Autostrada, which looked into these fantastic concrete formworks, but all pre-digital. So the kind of focuses on the development of these frames that will build up the library. And I'm sure these guys will talk you through all these processes that looks into bespoke glulam, and then applying the freshly made new end effector of the bands attached to the robot to actually machine and detail these structural frames. I think with that, I would like to give the word to the MARC students in the back. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. So us six, we're the team of MARC students that at this point are developing the phase 1 of the Wakeford Hall. So we started to really get into this design in February through the development of the master plan, from the master plan to the first approach of the building, as our tutors introduced briefly. So as Emmanuel mentioned, the general idea for this building was to pursue two skeletons that are tensioning a roof that is covering the lecture hall. The process that we're doing for designing in the Design and Make program is really engaging with making. So our development of the ideas is not only based in sketches. We go from the sketches to the models, to the CAD drawings, back to the sketches, back to the workshop. It's a very iterative process, and yeah, really through making. So this was one of the first models that was done, trying to capture the idea of having these two skeletons that are tensioning the roof. Why two skeletons? Well, among other things, because tension in the timber requires a huge force. So what best way of showing that force than with a skeleton that is making explicit the load, the path that the loads need to carry to go to the ground. So through this process, there were involved many references, as for example, the Molino table. This is a table designed by the architect, Carlo Molino. There are references that we have interrogated, really drawn over and over, trying to extract the best knowledge from them seeing how they work with the material that is timber, and trying to adapt these things into our structure. So let's say that the library of the Wakeford Hall project tries to be a skeleton that is inhabitable. It's a space where the structure is something that the students can engage with, and that is trying to create an amazing place to consult the books and to read.
So to talk a little bit about the kind of the ambitions that we kind of had, starting from kind of the master plan that was mentioned into this phase one of this project, which us cohorts of this year are concentrating on. So a lot of kind of the languages that came out was kind of a result in part by the technology of the attaching the bandsaw to the robot, which allowed kind of curved sort of cuts into these kind of wooden CLT pieces that we fabricate at Hooke. And so the notion was to really, something that we kind of responded to a lot is building almost like a furniture, something that you can actually interact with, touch with, and something that's tactile. And so a lot of kind of what is shown in the model is something where you can kind of weave in and out, experience the structure in many different ways. And in addition, the fabrication ease of it. So in part, a lot of this construction, a lot of the layout is these pieces that can be kind of put flat on the ground and then erected. So a lot of it, you can kind of imagine it as a flat pack, sort of.
So as I was mentioning previously, and Nozomi said before in the conversation, the design is not something linear, and that's something that we're very aware of through this process of design and making. So from the Molino table, interrogating it, we went to the next stage, that is this prototyping here. So it's a 1:5 version of the library made of flat pieces, as Kevin just pointed out. That was trying to research into this way of making flat pieces, creating a space, a volume. From that point, we elaborated a more inhabitable version that was starting to include things such as staircase, mezzanine, double height spaces, how the people interact with the building. From this point, we, in parallel, started to make one-to-one pieces. How is this technology really informing the design? How easy is to handle the one-to-one pieces? How can we put them into robot through this amazing end effector that Charlie has done for us? And in conversations with Mike, that is in the robot cell, programming the robot, making these things possible, saying like, what's the minimum radius that we have? In conversation with engineers, saying like, you need more material, you need less material, trying to achieve the time for gluing, because yeah, among other things, the time for gluing each piece is 30 minutes. So how do we build something in only 30 minutes of gluing time? Trying to sculpt the pieces with the bandsaw to get the best of them to make this space a much better place. And so we try to put a little bit of a selection of what the things that we are working at the moment, from the process of making these pieces through the prototypes, from the testing of the pieces to realize how strong are these elements, to the process of making the reinforcement for the foundation, and in parallel making a 1-to-10 prototype or model of this space. As you can see, they're done with flat pieces that try to interlock to create this volume. Any suggestions?
Just to kind of mention a little bit of this architectural spaces. So just kind of a small glimpse into thoughts that are in this model is this is kind of where the entrance of the library will be. It's a double story height space. And then kind of from here, you can kind of visually see all the different locations that you want to get to. And this lower part is more of kind of private workspace, reading spaces, and there's some sketches over there, these blue sketches that kind of hint at a little bit of life that this model otherwise is a bit kind of not really showing. And so you have maybe kind of workspaces, sitting spaces below, and then kind of this almost destination space on the top. So a lot of thoughts that we students had that the campus didn't really have is kind of private student spaces where they can kind of retreat to, because.
Pass the drawing over.
Oh no, no, rather not. Or just kind of look at it whenever you have a chance. This place, because perhaps, yeah, this place that I guess Hooke Park is a very busy place, and workshop and studio, it's very cramped. So a place where, rather than so much where you can just borrow books, but rather students have their own kind of retreat in the campus. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, it'd be great to have a bit of a discussion, I suppose, while we're here, got the time to, I don't know, to talk a little bit more. I don't know if anyone out there's got any immediate questions or thoughts or observations.
How far have you come in terms of the manufacturing process? You started making it?
So at the moment we have one piece fabricated, and it's in the robot cell, and we are doing all the cuts. And yeah, the next week we will start with the next frames and butterflies of the skeleton.
This thing of design and making in parallel implies many conversations with engineers and what is possible and what's not possible. So in the last months, we have been going through many iterative processes, sending the engineers the pieces like, this is what we can make, this is what we want to do. They replied, this is not possible, you have to add material, you have to take out material. So we started with some ambitions. We can make everything, we can make the entire building, and then we start realizing, well, this takes a long time to fabricate. So this first piece in this picture was the first full-size one-to-one piece. Like, we made many tests that size that is, yes, one-to-one, but it's not a real piece. That was done last week. It was also put into the robot cell last week, and the results are really outstanding. Like, we're really happy with the results of them. In parallel, we have been making the excavation, as you can see in that picture, and the reinforcement for the concrete slab and the foundation.
How much of this is library?
So that entire model is the library. Yeah. So basically, we didn't do the full 1-to-10 model of the entire Wakeford Hall, but the idea is that this is one skeleton, then is the lecture hall in the middle, and another skeleton in here. So if we can extrapolate this model, this part in here would be that library. This is the correlation between the both of them.
How do books behave with so much wood? Sorry? How do books behave with so much wood? Is there moisture? I'm just curious. Books.
Yeah, so I mean, we're creating a heated building, fully enclosed, so the moisture content will be always under control. I mean, also these pieces, being bespoke glulam pieces, need to be dry all the time. So we will make everything that is possible to keep a super controlled moisture and temperature into the library.
When does your degree program finish, and how much of this project do you finish by that?
we're finishing the construction of this of the phase 1 by the end of November, beginning of December. So we then concentrate on our thesis that we have to end by the end of January. So our aim at the moment is to try to build the skeleton and try to create some kind of waterproof enclosure, because as I said moments ago, we cannot let these frames to be exposed to the rain, because it would be not good.
Is this like a relay project that someone has started? And another group of students? Yeah. So you passed on.
There's a bit of like an overlap actually with the MArch students. It's a year and a half long program. So the next cohort, next year's students, we overlap for about the extra months this first term. And there's a collaboration involved in that and passing on.
So what did you inherit from the program before?
So the previous cohorts, they've actually had to. They were the first group to actually interrogate the competitions, and they created prototypes to really free up the thinking about what this building could be. So you saw the sawmill shelter as kind of this bed of experiment and activities that can really inspire our generation to be imaginative, be explorative, and experimental.
Probably worth stating clearly, isn't it, that sawmill roof is the proposed system for electoral roof. Basically, so that was the test bed for having to understand timber intention. I guess looking back, right back to the project that William and Chris proposed, presented, using timber intention as a very kind of underexploited strength that wood has.
So the students start with timber intention and they've extrapolated it into this construction.
Yes. I mean, you guys should be explaining that there's when they explain the sort of slices of the building, in a way, the prototype for the electrical room, which will come next summer, has been done. These guys have worked through, basically, the decision which came out of that was that we needed something to fix that tension to not just have cables going to the ground, so hence the idea of a more kind of developed skeleton for the library.
Yeah, so...
This skeleton is the right half of that model?
Yes.
Great, and that's the library.
Yes.
And so this roof intention pulls on this thing. And is this ready to receive that pull yet?
Yes.
Can you show us where it is?
So, that was the main aim. The main aim is creating a skeleton to resist the force of tension in the timber and making that skeleton inhabitable. So on the design of this skeleton, you can see here that there is like an annotated line that follows. And the proposal is that the roof and tension will be attached into this point. So there will be a huge tension force pulling the skeleton this way. And these pieces have been optimized and designed very diagrammatically to resist those loads in the best way. So in this iteration, one of the outcomes was that by pulling in this way, all this side is in compression, therefore needed a lot of thickness. So we said, okay, then it's a good opportunity to, for example, place the books in that place, like have a wall that has a depth. So many of these things of, okay, we need this thing because of the skeleton or the strength. How can we approach the building, this space, taking the best of this constraint? So yeah, I guess that this back and forward process has been really, really interesting. That's a good question. So at the moment, the library in Hooke Park is not comparable to the library in Bedford Square, but the intention is that it will be a growing library, and that this building not only will host the books that we have, but also the archive of all the drawings that were done for the design of the prototype house and the rest of the buildings, some thesis of the students and future material that will be created.
And in addition, it's not just like an archive kind of place, but rather it's going to be a mixture of books to seating and more of an engaging sort of space.
That's neatly brought us to 4 o'clock, which was exactly the moment we said we would have a little break. So I guess, unless there's an immediate question now, what I suggest maybe is, if you guys are willing to hang around and we can kind of keep the conversation going on here, look at the drawings, some of the video work, and then I guess at 4:30 we regroup for the next 2 pairs of conversations and wrap up discussion. Yep. Thanks, guys. So I'll introduce the next conversation. So Clem Blakemore and Jeroen Banal. I haven't never learned how your surname's pronounced. So Clem and Jeroen will present work that's been going on, in Clem's case, just this summer, but I guess preempted by some work she did at Hooke Park a few years earlier, and other work that she's done, including, interestingly, at Rural Studio, which is, I guess, a great reference for work at Hooke Park and some of the directions that Design and Make may take in the future. Jeroen's been running a visiting school generally 1 week at Easter, sort of been the pattern over 7 years, is it? With fairly specific agenda, making and often sensing and getting feedback from the sort of mode of inhabitation of the project. So I guess there's some overlap to explore possibly, but their actual kind of fundamental mode of operation is quite different. Anyway, let's just dive in, see the work and have a chat.
So thanks, Martin. It's been really great to see the amazing work that you guys do. So just hold that. I'm going to talk a little bit about a much more modest, smaller scale project, which was done in just 2 weeks as part of the Kinkham Visiting School, which, as Martin said, began this year and will continue next year. But I thought I'd begin just to give a bit of background to that. So I first heard about Hooke Park when I was studying at the Rural Studio in Alabama, which is kind of like the godfather of design build educational programs. So I was an outreach student. It's actually a 5-year undergraduate course for students at Auburn University, but it's also open to international students for a year. So I was there working on the 9th iteration of the 20K house, $20,000 house, which is a prototype house that kind of seeks to challenge the prevalence of mobile homes, which is a predominant form of housing for low-income families in the area. And when I came back to London, I continued my studies here at the AA, and alongside my unit work was trying to kind of keep involved with hands-on making and sort of more socially engaged projects. So I just started a few little things like a kitchen garden on a terrace up there, which was around for a few years. I think sadly became overgrown and was taken away. And also did a couple of workshops at Hooke Park exploring permaculture. So building on the kitchen garden that Georgie had started and beginning to think about ways that could be integrated more holistically into the master plan. And towards the end of my part 1, I formed a studio with 2 other students, Alex and Eva, and we moved to India for a year out to do 2 small-scale design-build educational projects. And it was at that point that Brett and Chris from the visiting school invited us to run 2-week workshops, kind of as small moments within a bigger project. So we'd been in India for about 3 months, I think, by the time this happened, and were joined for 2 weeks during the build process for some extra energy and help and hands on deck. And it became a kind of way of working, a way of enabling building projects, which has continued for the last few years. So this was the first structure in Dehradun, an outdoor classroom. We then went to Uttar Pradesh and worked on the first phase of a primary school building. And when I came back to London, I actually jumped ship and moved to the RCA. And in my 5th year, I wanted to do a live design build project. And I think approached Chris again about running it as part of a visiting school, at which point it kind of made sense to reconnect with Hooke Park and think about ways in which the things that I was exploring with this visiting school might tie in to what was happening at Hooke. So they very generously donated all the timber, and it was agreed that I'd do 2 visiting schools there and then with a very similar agenda move it to Hooke Park. So this was the back gable wall going up. That was the final structure, which is phase 1 completed. Phase 2 I'm still working on. Like Nozomi, it's been a bit of a solo labour of love, but very fulfilling. For the 2nd year, we actually scaled down and wanted to look a little bit at the kind of history of furniture fabrication in the area in High Wycombe. So we collaborated with a furniture designer from Arkol to look on a very small scale at steam bending and the production of furniture. And for the visiting school at Hooke Park, I've been collaborating with 2 really fantastic companies. So one is Timber Workshop, which is run by Alex Tomax and Jan Chicken-Alberts. So Alex actually was an architect and then became a timber framer and had done the summer build, I think, building the big shed. So there was sort of lots of connections there. And also with the engineers Stretcher Workshop, who I collaborated with on the pavilion for the Design Museum. The 3rd partner was Common Ground, who some of you may have come across. But they're a local arts charity in Dorset who have been around, I think, since the 80s, were more active then, and then kind of had a lull and is now being relaunched by 2 new directors. But they work across a whole range of media and disciplines. One of their projects was the commission of a series of kind of public sculptures across Dorset, including the Andy Goldsworthy gates that Shin was talking about. So it was through them, really, that we found the client for the project, which is the Dorset Wildlife Trust, which owns many sort of sections of land across Dorset, including the Kinkham Centre. So it's about 3 miles east of Hooke, so Hooke is on the left, and the Kinkham Centre is on the right. And the River Hooke actually runs through the site. And the project that they asked to be developed was a replacement of a boardwalk and riverside kind of platform, which had been there for about 10 years and were decaying. So we sort of visited the site, I guess, in January, so a long time before the visiting school started. We were developing various ideas, just looking at ways of having kind of moments along the boardwalk with elevated sections and seating, and settled on this idea of a kind of stepped seating area and the first section of the boardwalk for phase 1. I think what's been really important in the kind of design of all these visiting schools is this idea of kind of community barn raising. So kind of thinking about how the construction site can become a kind of platform for social celebration and a sort of platform for exchange and learning. So this is just some meetings with the client, again in advance of the visiting school, and the section of the, a sample of the types of drawings we had to produce, again, all in advance of the visiting school. So in that way, it's quite distinct from the other types of workshops which happen, for example, the ones that Shin talked about, which are quite free and experimental, obviously with a client and a 2-week deadline to produce something. There's quite a lot of extra preparation, and I think something that needs to be developed is how you balance that with more sort of free experimentation during the workshop itself. But what it meant was that we could launch directly into fabrication in the first week, blessed with some very nice weather to work outside. And the design with this series of portal frames meant that the students were able to work in sort of small teams with Alex overseeing them, but really sort of taking ownership for each section. And then we also had these sort of mini workshops within the 2 weeks. So one was with Ava Kellenberger, who's a graphic designer on the left, and the other was with Alice Blogg, who's a local furniture maker. So they came in and with the students developed sort of smaller moments of the design, so the signage and a bench that were then integrated into the pre-existing design. And as Martin mentioned, there were also moments where we went out into the community with, this was an ecologist from the Kinkham Centre who did a tour around the site. And I think in a way, this was partly for the students just to understand the sort of context in which they were working, but also quite useful for me to do a bit of research sort of on the job, so to speak, because obviously being based in London, the 2-week experience of actually living in the place is really crucial for kind of developing your understanding. And then also there were public lectures. So on the left, that's Pete Lader, the engineer, Alex Thomas, the carpenter, and Ed Fowles, the architect, talking about a project that they've collaborated on. I think a sort of shared theme between all the programs at Hooke is trying to bring those conversations between designer, fabrication, engineer together. I think too often in architectural education they're always very separate. So it was nice to bring them together. And then also Ava and Sam co-opted into being pizza chefs on the night of their lecture, but using Shin's fantastic oven. So there was a nice balance between events happening at Kinkham and at Hooke Park to begin sort of sharing audiences between the two. And then obviously trips to the beach, as Martin said, it's a great, beautiful coastline in the area. So essentially it was divided up in such a way that the first week was very much in the workshop, and then the second week was on site at Kinkham. So building the platform first of all, on which we then could assemble the prefabricated portal frames which had been made at Hooke, which then went up relatively fast. And they survived some really torrential downpour in the last few days, which is inevitable, but amazingly had very high spirits. And the structure was opened with this topping out ceremony involving a local storyteller and other people who kind of came from the local community, ending with a barn dance. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the kind of attitude towards the visiting school has sort of been borrowed from Shin's workshop in Kashirakura, where there's a sort of really strong connection with the local community and local festivals, where almost the workshop has kind of become part of the festival. And I think it's those events which really tie the work into the community in a way. So that was the finished structure, the staff of Kinkham. And that is it completed. So the second phase, which will take place next summer, is essentially the rest of the boardwalk, connecting it back up to the top of the field, and a sort of integrated fence/bench all along the length to make it stock-proof. And that's it. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jeroen van der Meijden. Even people in Holland cannot pronounce that, so it's okay. Yeah, I don't really know how to make a bridge. I think it's really great work. My work is going to be quite different. I think what's great about Hooke Park is that it sort of combines all these different aspects: materiality, site, local communities, but also quite sort of innovative work we've seen even from the history. And I guess the sort of current trajectory is that to try and integrate also digital tools. Is something that we've been looking at mostly in this workshop, and not just how digital tools sort of just make manual processes more efficient or let's say less labor intensive, but to see how they sort of fundamentally change a potential process of conception and materialization of architecture on site. So we started with actually coming out when I was working in the digital prototyping lab, where we were in the school here, where we're building already these little tools, also in collaboration with the DRL Masters program. So the idea of taking a CNC machine and 3-axis motors to the forest, where the 3 axes are then pulling strings and then turning this device into a sort of a wire pointer to build a sort of complexity that normally you would have a lot of logistics of measuring that out and fitting it on site through a sort of a semi-automated process where the wire pointer just points and stops, and then the humans sort of build against those points that are hovering in space, basically translating this sort of point cloud that is captured with a 3D camera of people movement, and translating that into a sort of a tessellated wooden structure that also translates the different intensities of movement to different sort of triangle sizes. So you see a sort of a higher density of material closer to the intersection of pathways in the forest. The idea really is to try and make something very unique to the site and also capture, I guess, qualities of the forest. Here in another year, we're using also a Kinect camera to make a series of snapshots around a single point in the forest with the idea of sort of mapping the sky dome and capturing that in a digital environment to try and have a digital process that sort of respond to that. So in the top right, if you look closely, there's still an image which is a stitched together composite of all those photos we took of the sky dome with the different intensities of light coming through the tree canopy. And we picked out a few views in that, which is shown in the top left with the red cones, which are then sort of informing the materiality of this sphere. So the idea of a sphere was really just to keep a sort of a pure form to try and then show and explore this sort of design and make process through this digitally driven system, where you see a lot of ribs that are all different because it's sort of automatically generated with different thicknesses and intensities of material. And then just having a simple system to bring them on site and put them up together. I think it's still there, I'm not sure actually. Maybe it's fallen down now, it was 3 years ago. The nice thing is you could really go in and then you would sort of roughly have your head in the original position of where that camera was, and then you'd be able to see different points around the forest with the wood sort of leaving openings and framing those very specific views towards the sea, towards a sort of a squirrel's nest. I think we selected some other points around the forest. So it is a very sort of nerdy and digital process that we are quite proud of and obsessed with, but at the same time we try to give it a sort of a purpose to make something very site-specific that takes on the environmental properties rather than just sort of experimenting with complexity for the sake of complexity. So this little tower is hopefully still standing strong. It's about 4.2 meter tall, and taking an idea of the previous project one step further, incorporating a growth over time process. So the idea of having those little cells is that they sort of accumulate step by step, first of all in the computer, where they try to seek out different views. And obviously when you grow higher and higher, the views are different over different heights. So that's why the tower is asymmetrical, because at the lower point it's sort of growing towards interesting views, for instance the workshop. And then when you come over a certain height, it was growing towards the view again, towards the sea. It was more or less in the same place as the previous project. And then here we also incorporated structural analysis in the process, in a sort of iterative process where the tower was getting thicker and stronger in areas where there would be sort of a buckling of material under the asymmetrical load. So the process is really important for this kind of work. It sort of relates to, normally I'm teaching here in a unit as well, so we sort of use this 5-day workshop just to try out certain conceptual ideas that then usually feed into the agenda the next year. This is a very important precedent of Negroponte in 1970s, where there was this experiment with little rats in a box that push blocks around, and the final configuration of these blocks, which you could read as a sort of a city, was never predetermined, but coming out of the interaction between the inhabitants and their built environment. So the idea really is that there's no architect here sort of pre-designing the configuration, but just a process that has certain rules about helping the rats to tidy up the blocks. And one version of MakeLab, we tried to do this literally in the forest as well. So we made the workshop students run around a bit like those rats in a box. We gave them something red because this is looking from a webcam and it was programmed to pick up red. So when we run out of red clothing, we just printed out A3 papers with solid red color to stick on people's heads. And then after a sort of a minute or so taking snapshots, you get a point cloud of density of people positions, body positions in space over time. So this shows already more interesting things than you can see with the naked eye, which is sort of based on the human preference of reading the forest and sort of understanding the nicer spots and also where there were some paths, for instance, this sort of desire path. The interesting thing is we let the process run through iteration. So here you see a later stage, still the humans, they stop building for a second, start running around and kind of intuitively exploring the forest. But now with some sticks already there. So we're basically building this field of sticks incrementally based on the reading of the people movements. And there's no sort of design preference or human interference in this process. So we just literally played out this game to try and see if there's something meaningful coming out. It is a little bit hard to see whether it is sort of correct or not. But there were sort of paths in here and also some space where which we call the sort of hangout spot. So yeah, this has been really interesting. We've went to places like Acadia in the US and presented this at a sort of hardcore computational design symposium. So it was sort of interesting to try this. But then we also had external examiners like Bob Shio saying basically if you take all this system stuff too serious, you end up actually sort of really taking over from any sort of human preference, and you have to be really careful with sort of putting too much hope on that. So actually now in our unit we're exploring this topic where automatic growth of cities or buildings, we also consider could have some dark sides, and it's actually part of that system of cities growing and sort of taking over from what humans really want in terms of a healthy and playful environment. Kind of following the situationist and this understanding of the city as a desire machine or a sort of consumerist machine. So last year we tried to make something that sort of tries to be the opposite of that and just be a very playful installation, which came out of another workshop in Taipei where we used parkour as a starting point. And we used the mapping, in this case, of one of the students wearing a good outfit to be captured, again with a computer, doing a sort of a parkour movement in the site, and then translating that also through a generative process to a structure that would sort of invoke that same movement and invite visitors to sort of recreate that. These pieces also have sensors and LED lights, so they flicker in a pattern that once you run and jump, it sort of rewards you with a ripple of light over your head. And that's really what we tried to do, even in a further step in MakeLab last April. Except with the difference that we wanted to make an installation that is not passive and it just responds to what people are doing, but also it tries to manipulate and control people in an interesting way. So the idea is it's a field of nodes that are all independent and all have an infrared sensor, so it knows when people are moving underneath. But then in this case, they send all the signals back to a central brain that would make certain decisions with a certain social agenda. So for instance, in a simple example, we talked about two people walking around. They all have white light. When they get close to a certain distance to each other, a red light would show to sort of try to signal something special was happening. We also experimented with a setup where if there's too many people moving, the system would kind of get annoyed and irritated and it would start flashing quite bright lights at them to try to move some of the people out of the space again. So the whole discussion about whether there's a sort of a respectful relationship, kind of like you have with your pet, like you have to sort of learn to understand it and respect it, and then you can learn it certain tricks, but it has certain desires by itself that it tries to impose onto the people underneath. That's it, really. We're putting this up in January over the terrace, so hopefully people can come and see it, and we'll sort of talk more about that further discussion. Thanks.
Great, thanks Clem and Ewan. Any immediate questions? I think given that we're going to be having a discussion half an hour anyway, things can be held in mind and we can widen out that discussion then. So, I'm going to introduce Zach Malika, Kate Davies, who are going to present the last pair of talks. Zach is a graduate from a couple of years ago of the Design and Make programme, so he'll talk about the Design and Make project he's now part of the teaching team, so can, I guess, place that in a bit of context of some of the agendas that the programme's pursuing now. And Kate's going to present a proposal for a new academic programme at Hooke Park, an MA to run alongside the MArch and MSc, as I kind of hinted at earlier on, focusing on the estate in the wider sense on the land and relating it to art practice.
Tell me if it starts to crackle again. So as Martin said, I'm now a tutor for the program, but I'm going to present the project, I guess, that we did as students in an attempt to anticipate some of what Kate will talk about. So specifically, we're going to talk about the woodchip barn completed in 2016, but with an emphasis on a component of it, the primary structure, the tree fork truss. And I guess the subtitle just refers to a notion that we'll explore throughout, but of forms which are inherent to material. So something we're quite curious of working with timber is every single bit of timber is a unique bit of timber, even if we try to typically counteract that. This image maybe is just an introduction to the mixture of technologies that we're talking about is extracted from a 3D scan taken inside the big shed that Nozomi showed while the woodchip barn was under construction. So you're seeing effectively a sliced plan cut through a real building. This presentation, this is the piece I'm going to focus on. So the truss, I guess let's call it, although I think technically we need to go with arching Virendale-like truss, maybe volumetric truss if we want to keep getting descriptive. But it's a 25-meter spanning structure composed of 20 unique beech forks that holds up the roof of this woodchip barn. To step back to the context that Martin talked about, the forest you're seeing in this image is Hooke Park. And I guess maybe to anticipate some of the discussion, I would put a little bit of a spin on some of the discussion we've talked about to say that I think there's an interesting discussion to be had around work outside of Hooke and the work in Hooke, and that I think this project in particular to me is a project which truly could not have happened anywhere else. And so in some ways speaks to quite a unique mix of these pieces. To expand on that, I think this did show up, but Hooke Park's made of 17 different species in the woodland. About 4 or 5 appear in this building, some because they're not really good for anything else, made it into kind of walls and are sacrificial. Others were critical to certain components of it. And I think sometimes for me, the way I talk about this project is almost a necessary evolution of previous projects. So I think starting with the workshop that William and Chris talked about earlier, which explored kind of form finding and arching structures. The interior, obviously something we didn't pursue in this project. The big shed, we stole some connections from, but also I think took the ambition to go a little bit bigger than Nozomi had in span. And this showing those trusses as well. TSS, the Timber Seasoning Shelter, represented an introduction of computation that earlier projects hadn't had, and was one that again we tried to take a step further. So this structure is made up of really a reciprocal grid of steam bent components, but similar to the woodchip barn, unique components. So there's approximately 120, I believe, components within the truss. And then I guess to emphasize something that maybe hasn't come up as much, but the tools that we make, or the tools that Charlie somewhere here makes, to allow us to build buildings. So we're doing things for which there's no existing set of instructions. The final precedent that has to be talked about is the boiler house. So in this project, rather than curving straight timbers, naturally curved timbers have been used to create this flowing wall. And so I guess to give a sense of what that looks like in the forest, students walked around with a kind of baby carrier and a laptop and an Xbox Connect, 3D scan selected trees in the woods, come back, figure out what they're after, and go for more. And that final wall. I think maybe in terms of what the setting off point for the woodchip barn is a recognition that this project uses the forms of these pieces of timber, but not their structural potential. And so when we start with the woodchip barn, that kind of structural side as well as increased complexity is really what we're after. And so I guess for the remainder, I'll talk to the woodchip barn, AKA the tree fork truss. Having seen the boiler house, wandering around as students, I think we knew that it was work that we wanted to pick up on, but then we saw trees like this and thought, there's a whole lot more to this to do. So I think the inspiration of the tree is a form which has grown in response to specific conditions to achieve cantilevers that we really can't achieve. And so the ambition of the project was to utilize these same members within a structure in the way that they're used in a tree. This isn't new work, many of you will know, and so kind of traditionally within boat building, as well as timber framing, these forms have been used. I think for us, the true ambition though was to say that, again, going one step further, although they're using the forms, they're using them two-dimensionally. And so they're taking slices out of a tree before taking curves. And that with a new tool on site, we could go one step further, using them as truly three-dimensional pieces. This, I guess somewhat cheesily, but presents the argument that we're trying to make, which is to question, typically our process takes an irregular material, unique and quite strong on its own, standardizes that, brings the complexity back into that material eventually, but only after having ended up with 10% of what we started with. And so the question really of the project is whether we could go straight from non-standard material to non-standard components. To show a quick film that I think, or a section of a film, that I think just emphasizes how important this site is to this material and also to the project. This is an extract that Kate had pulled from one of the videos that she's worked on with us. So I guess just that to say that as an introduction, really. Two more images of the building just to come back to it, and we'll get more. So looking at the top, I think it was a surprise to all of us when we finished the actual scale of this thing. And finally, looking in the interior. So what I'm going to do is work quickly through the design process and then just talk through the kind of steps of fabrication, because I think in some ways the unique bit of this project was the development of a workflow that doesn't exist. And so I guess given quite a simple brief, most of our discussion was a question of what to do with forks. This happened in a whole lot of different forms, some of them finger gestures, some of them pieces of paper that never survived, and some of the models. Months and months were spent going in loops trying to figure out what to do. In parallel, the research really was to try to document these forms. So it was silly to say that we were designing with forks if we had no idea beyond approximates what shape they were. And so we developed a technique from traditional techniques to go out into the woods and survey the shapes of these. This was repeated for 204 trees all around Hooke Park. And at this point, what you're seeing in colored is those that would eventually make their way into the truss, but selected from a massive number. Back in the studio, we developed techniques for automating the process of evaluating them. In this case, looking at relative diameters based on photographs taken in the field, and in this case, angles between them. So in some ways, the craziness of this project was we developed tools which would allow us to build about 200 more of these woodchip barns, but only got to build one. Those are all existing and for sale if anybody wants to talk. These two images, I think, really show an important moment of the project. The left represents a first computational approach to coming up with this form. So taking an approximate geometry and fitting trees within that. And on the right, most importantly, the largest structural test that was done before going for 25 meters. So at 1 to 20 and in the back of the room, we kind of felt it, said that looks pretty solid, and went for it. From a fabrication point of view, a 2/3 section was tested. So this allowed us to work through the entire workflow, going from forest with Chris, wrangling his arms a little bit to give us some forks, coming back in, going through 3D scanning, robotic fabrication and assembly, and then hanging it as it would be in the air. I'm going to show two pieces here. The diagram, please don't attempt to work through. It's intentionally confusing and overlapping, but it was an attempt for myself to work backwards through the process that took us from forks in trees to forks in the truss. And then a video that I'll show, which I may cut off a little bit early, but this video goes through that entire sequence for the project, and then I'll try to highlight a couple of components and hope that Kate will tell me when I'm running too long. So I'll start by saying there's going to be a ton of detail that I'll leave out that can always be answered with a drink in hand later. It's a slightly absurd process to try to work through every single step, but for me it's to emphasize, I guess, the most important. Starting with this image of Chris, I think a truly exceptional component of the program is the notion that our students can see their material standing and take it through to in a building. And so really, having surveyed and selected the trees that we wanted, we went out into the woods with Chris, armed with his suit, and started to take down trees in discussion about what we could have. So there's an interesting back and forth of those trees that we wanted versus those trees that the woodland could afford to lose. The felling itself is no simple task. Typically you're felling a roughly conical tree in the direction it wants to go and you're letting it fall. With these forks, if you imagine sort of a scissor action, it's quite critical to lie them flat. And so Chris had to go to an extreme effort to put them down, within a couple cases, us losing trees. I think an initial structural test was how we've typically seen this though, because most of them revealed flaws that otherwise would have become a problem. In total, 25 forks were harvested successfully from the woods, with about 5 or 6 broken. At this stage, they're weighing about 2/3 of a ton and over 5 meters long. A quite difficult moment was deciding at what size to bring them out of the woods, because we, in the end, will only use approximately a 3-meter section, but which 3-meter section you'll see is somewhat determined by the computer. This image showing in the colors each of the forks that appear in the structure, but the white dots showing every single one, and I guess the ticks, those that didn't really live through the process. It was interesting, though, having to consider parameters as simple as proximity. So I think, to Chris's chagrin, we took forks from all over the woods because those were the forks we needed, but we attempted to cluster them where possible. Bringing them back, this image of Sawhill, I think, is quite good for scale in terms of the significance of the pieces that we're working on. And I guess this image just emphasized that although we sometimes hide it like our failures, every single one of our high-tech, impressive digital things starts with a whole lot of kind of shit work. And so in this case, 2 of our summer builders peeling each of the trees. In the yard, we've been 3D scanning each of the trees. So using a process called photogrammetry, we're extracting millimeter precise, really 3-dimensional models of these trees that we can then begin to work with. That process really starts with just a set of photos, and the reason we use this as a technique is its accessibility in many ways. And so here you see about 60 images of the same object taken similarly to a panorama. And finally, although quite a bit of painful cleaning up of voodoo meshes aside, a clean fork that we could begin to work with. And so then we enter working with forks. In the background with our engineers of this whole process, we developed an idealized form. So an approximate shape based on a catenary curve and an approximate volume, which we went back and forth as we began to understand the forks. So the overall dimension of this is based on a real understanding of them. Here, a first attempt at populating that geometry. So you saw it a bit in the video where it looks like a bunch of forks are jumping around, but setting up strategic scripting to decide what goes where and how they might fit past each other. This overlay drawing, which crashes Illustrator each time I open it, shows 17 iterations of the truss overlaid together and what that looks like going to the engineers. To move to fabrication, because I think I do need to hurry up a little bit now. From the same model that we're able to produce drawings for our engineers, we produce fabrication information. And so these 9 bits of information for each fork result in 140 odd connections. Although every single one is unique, they're rule-based. And so this sketch really, I guess, explains the idea that there's only 3 types of connections within the structure. To bring the manual and the digital back, each of the joints was prototyped manually before being eventually worked out. So the version on the right that you see is an understanding from the robot's kind of abilities and the tooling on it of what version of the left might be achieved. And finally, to the robot cell, Pradeep and Sweta's home for quite some time. In this case, a milling head was used to machine each of the forks. I won't show more video because it was shown earlier, but we'll end that side just on this image to say that within the scope of this project, the minimum amount of machining was done. So quite oddly, looking at the structure now, the trace of the robot is more or less gone because all the connections have closed up quite snugly. Finally, to assembly. How we were actually going to assemble this is something we put off as long as possible because it seemed a bit crazy. But in the end, a jig was conceived in the big shed, taking up most of the floor space, using the pink and green holes to set out points in X, Y, and those vertical posts to bring them up in Z. At the same time, points had been machined into each fork to allow us to work in a calibrated way. This image to me is one of the most important, although not a great photo, but to say that not a single drawing was actually output in this process. So not a single printed drawing sheet exists from the assembly of the truss. Everything was taken out of Rhino. That process underway, the telehandler offering in a component which we've then strapped together. It's quite interesting to note that not a single piece has actually been attached at this point. Things are strapped and fixed and pulled, and some temporary screws, but the kind of flexibility to nudge and push things around was quite crucial. This video I'll show just quick because it's a second, shows the process of moving this about, and I think maybe the creativity that we sometimes need to get these projects done. So some relatively careful driving. I can't remember who was reversing, but people in this room may know, to bring the truss down to the site. And finally, lifting 3 tons into place on site, doing it twice over one day, and fixing this whole structure, which had taken about 8 weeks to pre-assemble over the course of about 4 days. Still a bit of disbelief, personally. I'll end on that image. I guess to me, the true curiosity of the project is the notion that underneath that craziness is a drawing of about 11 curves in Rhino, so that the entire complexity of the project comes from the material that we've started with. And just to say that I think it's only a first step, really. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Davies. So, as Martin's already mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about potential futures at Hooke and the development of a land-based MA, which completes a kind of triangle of MSc, MArch, and MA, which has been in the strategic plan, I believe. Still in development, so this will be a kind of, hopefully, a whirlwind, not too lengthy, whiz through some possible ideas for it that are under development. Just a bit about where I come from, because I think that the various things that I do interestingly collide in this course. One part of what I do is with Unknown Fields. I'm one half of Unknown Fields with Liam Young, which is what we call a nomadic studio. So we take a kind of range of quite extraordinary expeditions across to various places across the planet, looking at supply chains and landscapes of production, essentially. We've done, I think, 13, 14 different trips now over the last 9 years. And what we're really looking at is where all the material that constructs the city comes from. So we're interested in a whole range of different sites and landscapes as relational spaces, relational geographies that link me to somewhere in Bolivia, for instance. There's a little piece of a Bolivian salt lake, an Australian mine, a Chinese plane in my pocket right now. So that's the kind of the gist of what we do as Unknown Fields in terms of, I suppose, a kind of obsession with landscapes that construct the familiar, unfamiliar landscapes that construct the familiar, you like to say. So these are a few of the places that we've focused on over the last 9 years. Alongside that, I also do some work together with Emmanuel. We call ourselves Liquid Factory. And a lot of that is also site-specific, land-based, or landscape-based. And we're interested in the wild sites. And we've done a number of projects that are about taking technologies you wouldn't normally take to those kinds of spaces. This is actually a very brave chap called Tom Spillins, who's standing in the sea in San Francisco with a LiDAR scanner. And this is the LiDAR scan, which you can see. I won't go into too much detail, but because the scanner rotates, you've actually got a kind of heartbeat of the waves coming in. So we're interested in where the spaces are when you start to insert these kinds of technologies into complex sites, dynamic sites, difficult sites to engage with. I won't show all of this, actually. because we'll be here forever. One of our more recent ones was a project we call Raven. It's a kind of Raven robotics collaboration we did with some people at UCL. And it was about looking at trying to understand how a robot can calibrate its own relationship with the space it's in. As robotics is usually done in white rooms that are easily understandable or easily calibrated, the robot has to be positioned in a certain place so that everything within that setup knows where it is. So we were interested in how you could take robotics into something that's a little bit more complex and get some kind of feedback loop between, say, the 3D scanner and the motion of the robots. So the third bit, I suppose I am department head of media studies here at the AA, which I think we have 25 different tutors running an amazing range of courses, from hand drawing. Anderson, sitting on the front row, is one of the tutors on the media studies crew, all the way to VR and 3D scanning and so on. So, and that's the kind of major interest I have in the ways that we decide to work, or the ways that designers and artists work, the tools we use, and how those tools affect the way of working and how we relate to the world, because they are our tools of communication, tools of understanding. So I suppose somewhere between those three things sits the proposal for this new course, which I'm incredibly excited about. I think it could be really exciting territory. I'm really happy to be involved with it. So context, you've seen all day. Hooke Park. Beyond Hooke Park, obviously also the context of Dorset in terms of land. The course is really trying to bring a land-based focus to Hooke Park, in terms of, rather than focusing on building and construction and fabrication technologies, we're going to turn around and look at the forest and look at the land and look at the landscape. So we have an incredibly rich geology, takes us into deep time with the Jurassic Coast, plus a huge range of productive landscapes, obviously Portland, military landscapes, they do tank training. It's an incredibly rich and interesting context, and even just the wider field away from Hooke. And then a kind of another context would be the context of land art, the history of land art, going right back to the heroes. You've seen this image already today. The relationship with some of those artists, specifically to Hooke Park, which is very interesting as well. Through to more contemporary artists and creatives that are working with and around and within the environment. Batinsky being a classic. There's also a really kind of strong emerging group of contemporary artists working with technology in relationship to landscape and environment. That's a kind of a big emerging field. And we're looking at, as a methodology, really focusing on fieldwork, the idea of being in that landscape. Taking our studio desk into the landscape. And a safe, I think field is probably the better word than site. This also relates to a course that I run here within the media studies course department around fieldwork. Interested in it as a contingent space, as a space that moves, that has dynamics, that changes over time, obviously. That is responsive and flows, as Susanna Ewing puts it. As a fieldwork, as a practice across lots of other disciplines, obviously through sciences, anthropology, archaeology, and increasingly creative practice. as a way of trying to mediate and understand our relationship with a space, place, or site. And trying to kind of engage with those sites, obviously, in terms of time as well as space. So this is a finish line photo that's, it's not a spatial photograph, it's a photo in time, because all of those people are crossing the finish line at the same time. Not at the same time, they're all crossing the finish line in this picture. So we get a sense of like some dynamics of working with scores, with data, with complexity, working with the relationship between the technologies we choose to use to depict landscape and the landscapes themselves. This is the first lander to photograph the surface of Venus in 1975. So there's a really nice relationship between that lander and this landscape, and what you get somewhere in the middle is this, which is something else entirely. This is something I love, which is a guy who took a flatbed scanner down into the ocean to scan some coral. That's what we're interested in. So I think the relationship between the ways, as I said, the ways of depicting or the technologies that depict, that quantify, that increasingly allow us to datify the landscape. It's really important. This is a project by a student of mine from Diploma 6, Zan Wang, which is just an interrogation of the kind of aerial surveillance systems at a specific site in Mexico. This is, I won't show you all of this either, but this is a piece that we did with Unknown Fields, which is a stitching of a whole range of LiDAR scans of Australian gold mines together to give you a kind of journey underground through the spaces that have been or will be excavated to create the world's gold store. And I suppose this is a drawing by a student of another student of mine called Chapman Khan. One is the scale of a continent, or the scale of a country, and the other is a drawing of the scale of a cell. So just to indicate the kind of obsession or the kind of interest that I think we'll have in the depiction, the mapping, as well as imaging. And I think alongside that goes kind of to look at the full range of ways in which we communicate space, landscape specifically, so painting, poetry, literature, art, obviously, architecture, all the way to the sciences, to microbiology of a tree cell. And the kind of work that we would be looking to produce ranges from physical installation to more digital work, video work, projection pieces. This is an artist called Ilka Halso, who this a project I really like, is called the Museum of Nature, where he just goes around basically putting up scaffolding around existing trees. Like I said, through to kind of technological engagements. This is a project by friends of ours, Marshmallow Laser Feast, who did a virtual reality piece for the forest. This is what you see when you're in the helmet. These are all the load of kids watching it in the forest. And it was a piece that imagined how various animals see the forest. So it was trying to put you in the let you see the forest through the eyes of a bat or a mouse or various other animals. And then beyond that to the kind of relational spaces that exist on the internet that condition our understanding of landscapes or the ways that we experience them, which might for a large part be remotely. this is a map of one specific site in Mexico and all its online manifestations. That guy called Mondq. And I think, I suppose we would be looking at Hooke in particular, in the first instance, obviously, as a microsite. The idea of what does site-specific mean? Can you make something site-specific to a twig? I like the kind of very site-specific nature of the each individual fork that Zach was pointing out. I really like the map that you have. There's the building and then there's the map of the forest where all the trees came from. That building is all those places, all those sites. It's this kind of confluence of all those spaces. And then wider Dorset context, and then the wider UK context, as is probably set out in a series of projects. I think that's probably as far as we know so far, so I'll stop there. Okay, thanks.
First of all, say thank you for inviting me to to attempt to moderate some discussion around Hooke, which is probably unmoderatable. But I think it's interesting in retrospect to have seen such a multiplicity of approaches around a specific place, which speaks of the way in which there's a uniqueness about less the forest itself, which is a forest, but rather the ways in which that forest can be interpreted, which I think is something about the great possibilities for the program, but also for the variety of approaches that are endemic within it. So in that regard, I think it's would be quite interesting to hear from you as program directors, most probably, the three of you, past and present and future, just in terms of what possibilities you think lie within the immediacy of that context. I mean, I know it's something that you've already spoken about, but just in that regard, it's sort of something of the dynamism of the place, because it seems quite specific in terms of what it has to offer as sort of raw material, say. Because there's very much in the discussions a description of process and those things that are made, but less on what there is within those things that are made, sort of the beginning materials, the materiality of it, which is of course as cultural as it is actual.
Seems to have fallen to me already to be talking, which wasn't quite the idea. You should be addressing questions elsewhere.
In that case then, why isn't one of the students who is incoming to the program answer that question? Because of course, it seems that in applying to something like the Design and Make program, I imagine most applicants don't normally visit the forest, so there's kind of an initial encounter with it that is one that hopefully illustrates those possibilities.
In that case, we should invite the new intake of students to come and sit here and not over there. Come on, guys. Thanks.
Sorry, I walked in slightly midway through that question, so I'm not. Could you repeat it, please?
I'll sum up. I mean, what do you find distinct about the possibility of encountering the program and then the forest that lies beyond that?
I guess it'd be difficult to try and pick any one thing that's different. I mean, it's in the woods. It's only got 6 people on it, our year anyway. So there's more tutors kind of like
than us. I guess the fact that we're building stuff that has a long-term kind of plan as part of a bigger plan is quite unusual. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are lots of things. I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of that stuff. I guess I'd have to say it's probably much more of a physically tangible course than many other programs. Just being right there with the kind of full scale material and just getting to work with it, both hands on and with the technology that's out there. It's really great. You wanted to add anything? No,
Just with a view to what I've just been talking about, I suppose. What I think is interesting is the possibility to reverse the traditional kind of relationship that students might have here in this school with anything beyond the city, so anything landscape-based. The usual field trip, which is, as you know, we go out there for a week, take a lot of pictures, come back and then try and figure out some designing afterwards. And I think the potential to revisit and continually return to the same very small space on the planet is actually incredibly rich. The kind of living in it and living with it in an architectural sense specifically, I think's potentially amazing. And then obviously the rich kind of, like you allude to, the cultural relationship historically mankind's had with forests, folklore, the kind of the fairy tale, all the way to the incredible specifics of the material itself, which you guys have been looking into really intently. I think it's depth that we're getting in this place. I think a lot of other design activities go broad and surface, and I think this is a real potential to go deep and into some kind of depth in a very small site and find something incredible in there, really.
I think, and maybe just add on that, because I think the last line there, its size, is to me an incredibly important, because I think what makes, at least in my experience of forests, what makes Hooke unique is it's quite small. Maybe that's just North American speaking, but I think the notion of a forest in which you can, over 3 years, have come to a point, albeit having spent a lot of time in the forest, but a feeling like there's not that many areas of the forest that you don't know is quite unique. And so looking around the forest and finding surprise maybe quite rarely, but then enjoying it quite a bit when you do is a unique, there's not that many forks that I've not laid eyes on and thought about trying to convince Chris to give us. But so I think that's a really unique moment within that, of being able to achieve a much more thorough understanding of a place that I went through.
Well, it does seem one of the, I mean, knowing most of the projects is it seems the kind of the duration of time that you've spent there and the depth of knowledge, as you were saying, is directly legible within the project itself. So within the truss of the wood chip barn, maybe I know it too well as well, but it's a kind of you can see the trees within it, then you can see the material transformation as it goes along. So I think in that regard, and this is probably for you, Zach, what value did you place in that transformative process? Because it seems that one of the beauties of Hooke is as an environment, there's moments in time when it's not raining, when it's not muddy, etc. When the bluebells are out, as every cab driver will always tell you. There's a kind of, you get that sort of idea of the kind of English natural landscape that's very beautiful. And then there's also a way in which that can be translated into the buildings or into sort of forms of engagement with the community that are themselves also beautiful. So the truss itself, which I'm a sort of fan of, in terms of the way in which it becomes a structural object, has the kind of endemic beauty of the forest and the endemic beauty of the computational design wedged within it, which I think is a sort of really good example of the possibilities of the course.
Yeah, I think I would be the first to admit that I didn't really do my research when I found out about Hooke. I kind of found an architecture school in the forest and thought, let's go there. And so I think the transformative bit is quite an important one, because I've come out of Hooke Park unwilling to really think about doing any of the work that I likely would have done beforehand, because I kind of leave thinking that's quite boring. And I must say I'm also guilty of not really having gone outside of Hooke much during the year and a half that I was a student, at least. So it's quite a closed wall to that. But I do think it's a really interesting one maybe for other people to explore as well, because I think there is that question of, as soon as, like right now, the way I imagine it, we're building buildings in a woodland, out of a woodland, for a woodland. And as that starts to broach, I think that it's just interesting to think, at what point is there a certain number of buildings for which there's the current material for? In which case, how many is that? How far away is the next woodland? At that point, would we be considering other woodlands, in a sense? Like, would we be doing? And so then there's just all sorts of pieces that I think start to become quite an interesting discussion within that.
Oh, just to follow up. I mean, there's interesting notions of timing within all of this. So, of course, on the one hand, you have a extremely old mineral landscape. Then you have a forest that is, 60 years old? 1600 and further back. Yeah. So you have the sort of the growth of the trees, but then also at the other end you have the kind of timing of some of these processes. So if you're laminating something with glue, you have a kind of workable window using a potentially centuries old material that is sort of a 1 hour kind of thing. So I think there is a way in which those various times of things get encoded within the legibility. And then of course you have transitionary objects such as the media representations that only occur within those representations rather than the built object themselves.
I don't know if the responses, I agree with all of that. I think adding on to that, how long any of them will last, because I think an interesting side of the kind of experimental nature, as Euron says, of kind of 3 pavilions where every year you ask, I wonder if that's still standing. And I think that applies to each of the buildings, a workshop that, I don't know, William, you'd be better asked than me, but I can't imagine that at the time when those first 3 were started, people thought that 30 years on we wouldn't have touched them, and that they would still be kind of, that the workshop might still be the best building on site, and the refectory along with it, 30 years and minimal repair work. I just can't imagine that was the assumption, in a sense.
I think it probably was. and that's why I can sort of differ with you, because I didn't think. Well, we were basically set a challenge to build a building using forest thinnings, and we did spend an inordinate amount of time in the design process and going through the details of it. Because I was actually asked a really interesting question, because I did give a talk to the current students about how I built the refectory. And someone said to me, well, what did you do when you wanted to change your mind on site? And basically, because I'm an architect, my whole approach was I wasn't going to change my mind on site, because that is just too stressful. But you had done a fantastic amount of drawings, and certainly working at ABK, which as interesting practice, we were very interested in surface and material and tactile, and how buildings behave. And you then had this unique challenge to then use forest thinnings to make a building, and you then set about doing it the best you can. And maybe I was a bit unusual I know I was working in an architectural practice in Camden. I do actually live outside London, and did actually own a chainsaw at the time, and do have a small amount of woodland. So it wasn't like Hooke wasn't the first wood I'd been into. I'd spent, in my childhood I'd been in woods quite a lot. And here was suddenly, through Makepeace and the thing, I was given this fantastic opportunity to build a building. And I wasn't trying to go through some sort of out-of-body experience. I was going, Christ, I'm an architect, I got a really good chance to build something interesting, and I like building things, And then it's incredible, if you do your best, suddenly it turns out 30 years later, it's still there, and it's great, and that's architecture to me. It's not, I think that's really important.
The duration of the buildings, an interesting one, because of course, in terms of the insurability of a building, I think it's 50 or 100 years.
Sure.
Which seems a kind of a bureaucratic way of viewing them. Then also within some of the built works there's a different sense of time in terms of their fragility. So there's a kind of, there are some quite poetic moments at Hooke where the forest has had the buildings returned to them. It seems all those built artifacts, I'm thinking of the Goldsworthy piece, Shin, that you lay along, which seems to be a kind of very apt way of describing that cycle or that returning within it.
Yeah, I think basically Andy Goldward declined to do new piece. He said that it's gonna cost too much for us. So that's one way of saying very polite. He said that it actually should be standing there and decay by themselves. I think maybe I just put a bit of different context in response to question you're raising before. If there is an actual opportunity presented by Hooke Park in the form of provoking some form of real experiment, then either possibly some of the prototypes should collapse, or maybe materials didn't work, or that kind of how much of those costs we can pay as a school or environment. But in fact, probably including myself, I'm just asking why everything we built looks like architecture somehow. Could be something else, or why they have to be building. Could be much more different, diverse type of result might come out as long as some kind of framework is clear somehow. So I don't know. That might be worth asking as a question to ourselves, I suppose. Yeah. I don't know, because otherwise, how we could somehow, without putting any hierarchy between technology bits, robotic arms to sustainability and computations to all those materials and histories and natural environment in promote itself, if we consider that is ingredients, then probably we might be talking about something we can't even imagine. Which form does that take, or how long it's going to take, or how long it's going to last, I suppose. So.
It seems that one of the other things, another form of making is demolition, obviously, which is just sort of making of different stuff. Which I think, in terms of the way that you view the continuity of projects, or the fact that the programs now move towards projects that encompass 2 or 3 cycles of students, which is a form of longer time span of making. I'm just wondering also how that fits into other thinking about what Shin was saying, which is sort of the unmaking of Hooke, or the way in which things are able to be reconfigured in the way that the growth and then harvesting of the forest allows a reconfiguring of the landscape. It's a constantly dynamic thing, which we often think of architecture in its most conventional sense as sort of fixed for a period of time, and then either entirely removed, but not necessarily remade. So I'm wondering what the thoughts are of the sort of the various programs, but also the students in engaging with that.
Could I just make an observation about what Shin was saying as well, which was I was taken by the barn that you'd worked with the forks. I thought what was interesting was so much of the work had something to do with the form of the trees and work, but weirdly what happened to your particular shape, by the end it was a very human form, and there was a pair of legs and bent back over. And I thought the more you kept talking about it, it was the first one that I'd actually seen a human form. Maybe that was just me reading it in that sense.
I think a dinosaur was the other one we talked about.
Didn't see a dinosaur in it at all, but it did become very human, whereas a lot of the determined buildings, you do see the natural forms that are around about you in the whole thing, which I thought was interesting. I did want to say, because I'd spoken to Martin about Lon's discussion. I don't know if this is the time to mention it, but should I throw it in just now, Mark? I'll leave it until later.
You're on a roll, so you may as well.
A very short roll. I was really interested about what Kate was saying about the place as well, and it made me think of a friend I have that's up in Orkney, at the very top of Scotland. And when the referendum was on, and the potential of the Scottish government moving back up to Edinburgh, he said that, that would mean that people are getting closer to where we are, which means they'll probably get involved in telling us what to do. And it's quite interesting, this thing that I was speaking to Martin about, this idea that in Bedford Square, apart from going for a couple of weeks, I think, or a group of people go, they don't really know much about the outer reaches of what you were discussing, and also the landscape around. And I think it's a fascinating balance how that's going to work to keep that kind of specialness of a place, but to also somehow incorporate it with the AA that's in Bedford Square here. I think that's a really interesting area of how what's going to happen. I don't know. I know David Green has a few ideas. But certainly, it was just to say that Lorne are thinking about that as well. And it was really interesting what you had to say there. Anyone else?
Quite interested in the idea of, you describe architecture as a spatial practice, of embracing that idea of practicing space and seeing that landscape as a space of rehearsal. So it should be kind of this place that's worked and reworked and worked and reworked. And I think it's the rehearsal studio rather than the stage. And in certain ways it needs to be the stage as well, which is where it gets complicated, right? But I like the fact that it's as familiar as the studio you go to every day, or as familiar as your the space you might rehearse for a dance again and again and again. And I think that the modes of practicing space are potentially a lot more varied than have been done in the past, as Shim's pointed out. I think that's a really nice point.
I mean, I think from the perspective of the course, what we're really trying to do is provide time and space to experiment. I think most of the time we predefine things too much and we don't let the experiment and the prototyping inform back into the design. But in a way, it's a quite complex kind of issue, because there's so many different kind of components to it. But as you mentioned, we have space now because this is a multi-cycle kind of building that we're engaging with. So it's really starting to emerge now, the potential of taking more time to experiment and prototype things and learn from it.
Well, the feedback, or not. The feeding back of material processes and knowledge seems much more evident. So it's actually, you're saying that in effect that all the joints the robot engineered have all swelled up and closed. So there's a way in which those things do sort of come about, but also seems the engagement with the various buildings, or the ongoing engagement, is something that the various people who are not just the students or program participants engage with on the site. So I'm just thinking, so you have these sort of often very interesting conversations with either the cab drivers who drop you off, who will sort of give their informal commentary on the various architectures that are being constructed, or people walking through the forest who have a kind of different way of explaining, coming across those various entities, but also, some of whom have grown up in the local community, so know the history of the forest through their engagement in those ways. So there's a kind of real dynamism in the way the work is also received. But I just think, in that regard, what sort of ways are you continuing to explore the possibilities of engaging that community, or what relevancy I think there is in sort of engaging that community, which is sort of a different way of answering or discussing. Where you were talking about, Eddie, there's that immediate community, then of course there's the larger community here within the AA, so there's the architectural community, but there's that one who sort of, I think quite interesting, thinks it's sort of mad to build a wood chip barn where you can have an aluminum barn, because as architects, those are the sort of the discussions we're always coming up against. So what forms of talking to the community? Maybe that's for you, Clem, something you've begun initiating.
Yeah, so I guess the Kinkham project was the first, I think I'm right in saying it's the first thing fabrication to go outside of it. And I can see there's a real dilemma if that is the direction that Hooke Park goes in. How do you maintain the experimentalness while you have to be answerable to clients and deadlines? And I think it's going to be hard, but I think it also offers a really fantastic opportunity for the bit of architecture which I think personally is slightly missing from Hooke Park, which is that negotiation. Because I think it's a very peculiar situation at the moment to have a kind of, to almost be your own client. And actually, the opportunity that Hooke Park offers in terms of a unique architectural experience, and I guess I'm, coming from the rural studio pedagogical model, but that process of negotiation with the site and a client and time and cost are things which are just missing from architectural education and could be explored at Hooke and kind of currently aren't. And I think in a way, what you've been talking about, the site and having the woodland, it's its greatest asset to have this big playground to experiment in, and also perhaps a slight problem that you have that freedom and you're not forced out yet. Maybe you will be when you run out of space.
Maybe it's really important to have these multiple streams rather than just have a single conversation, have multiple parallel projects running, and some of them are more constricted or restrained by budgets or clear briefs, but some of them might be of a whole different nature. Totally kind of going back to what Shin mentioned, the explorative nature of us building without predefining what the outcome is, so.
Well, it might actually free Hooke Park to be, as you say, completely ephemeral. If there's another whole body of work which is solid architectural work, maybe that liberates Hooke Park to be something that's constantly shifting. But I think you're right that overlap. I mean, Hooke Park, like any workshop environment, has the amazing quality of completely different projects rubbing up next to each other. I mean, I think that exists here at the AA, but behind closed doors, and you don't really always know what's going on. And the workshop, it just happens organically that you're next to someone doing something completely different at the same time. So that's a real quality, I think, and the living there as well.
The extremity is quite noticeable at Hooke. So you have the tangible buildings on the one hand, which here in Bedford Square we have much less of. But on the other hand, you also have the kind of way in which there's an appreciation of those things that go on that stretch far beyond it. So I'm just thinking of Onkai's steam bending video that he didn't want released, that a number of people have sort of watched of him just bending those sort of incredible trees, which have its sort of own resonance, which is quite nice. So you have those extremities, because I think within Hooke, it's an incredible environment to have those multiple voices and all those different types of conversations, but them to actually result in things, whether they're kind of sort of the media representations on the one hand, or the actual physical built, component and building on the other. There's a real richness and uniqueness in that. So.
To me, one of the most exciting things about Hooke Park is it just seems to always be so clearly a living laboratory. Everything you lay your eyes on, everything that's built there, you can track a sense of rigor, very different types of thinking. And I've showed photographs and drawings of this object, and I'm finally thrilled to finally meet it. And so I'm so glad that one of the wonderful things about the history of Hooke Park is so short, that we have this real privilege of still being connected to where these things came from. And I think one of the challenges in going forward is how to simultaneously almost be archiving and celebrating and presenting all of the richness that is relatively immediate, and not losing it as we're also moving forward, but to let that fuel the student experience constantly. It's really a fabulous, unique opportunity. So I'm glad to meet you all in this.
I was trying to think of examples of Hooke Park, maybe in the States. I'd have to dig back to Frank Lloyd Wright setting up Taliesin West, maybe a remote school of architecture, albeit in a very different landscape. And Wright was really insistent there'd be a library there. And Wright was inspired in part by Thoreau's Walden, and Walden is all about Thoreau's book collection and his insistence that not just writing a book, but reading was a part of that world. So I wanted to go back to Kate's presentation, the role of a discourse, or indeed writing in this landscape, not being a 2-week trip, but being immersive. Do you think there's a writing practice to be found specific to the landscape? And on top of cartography, is there a space, when we're thinking about a library there, that is about the collecting of these new texts?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think putting a library there is a flag, isn't it? It's a magnet to try and draw writers into the forest. And I think that it's kind of there in the historical relationship to, and our deep kind of cultural relationship to forests. I think it's obvious that needs to be there. It's I think one of the things that we're imagining in relationship to the MA with some kind of relationship to writing practices in the main school, but also there's a big network of local landscape writers around Dorset. There's a kind of resurgence of landscape writing in general, not just relationship to landscape, but I think the idea of the retreat, the writer's retreat, the space and silence and atmosphere that it would give a writing practice would be something to bring a great deal of richness to all 3 programs, actually, because I think there's something to be gained from really examining the type of language that's used to describe landscapes like that, and to understand why certain ways of describing it or evoking it return again and again, and then to bring those verbal descriptions through into a design process, which happens already. I mean, I think words that are used to describe forests are repeatedly used to describe some of the buildings that have been built at Hooke. So I think that the languages across all types of media, I think when I talk about depictions, it's, poetry to point cloud.
I wanted to ask a question, because as an outsider experiencing all of this for the first time, it's been really interesting to kind of see the whole process that's gone on there. And for me, it seems like this whole place is about transformation. So transformation of the forest into a built form, or the way that the site's evolved over time from, I guess, the kind of more traditional practices of construction into these digital forms. And I guess there's some reflection on, as educators or as students, the transformation that occurs with the student taking part in this process. So Zach, you mentioned that you probably won't go back into doing whatever else you wanted to do before, but what is the idea? Like, what are you trying to show the students? Is it this idea of how the hand is also still involved with the digital, or like there's so many different outcomes, but maybe as some of the teachers, I'd love to know about what you're seeking to show students that they can't otherwise get in a more traditional educational environment.
Can't avoid that one, I guess. So I think the predeterministic question, which has come up a few times, like to challenge conventional practice, which really, what is taught is, okay, there's a design question, there's a whole series of ways of intellectualizing that, but ultimately the aim is representational. And I guess the professional take on that is kind of a codification that informs then someone else to go away and make it. And I suppose the argument that probably everyone here is sharing in some way or other is there's a whole other realm of a form of thinking that isn't about representation, it's about using your body. It's a phenomenological argument, isn't it? You use your, tacitly gain knowledge through an embodied interaction with the world, whether it's, felling a tree, whether it's, working on a lathe, whether it's, lifting a piece of wood, whether it's pushing a pen on a paper, but those embodied interactions being a fundamental part of how we actually, act as designers, but how we also kind of transform the world, and having that kind of ability in a place like this to really foreground that. Design and make, it shouldn't be called design and make, it should be one word somehow. Like immediately we're making that distinction, that's the error, it should be design make, whatever. So I suppose to find mechanisms where we're able to avoid that predeterminism, where we're not saying, we are kind of breaking, I suppose what William was describing a little bit, there's one model which is to draw everything and then make it, and I guess then feed it back into subsequent projects. Obviously, there's other ways of getting feedback than just within one cycle, but, within one project. But I suppose to have that opportunity, like it's tough within one academic year to kind of fully capitalize on that feedback, and I guess that's the moment that we're addressing now, I suppose, with the Wakeford Hall project, which is a phased project. If we look back at the 8 projects we've done, we've either done, I guess, there's a caretaker's house, which did take a few cycles, done a slightly different way, and then it's basically been either very small houses or sheds of various forms, I guess, pavilions and sheds, and all useful, hopefully. And I guess now we're addressing the fact that we are delivering a serious permanent building, and that there is a client in a way. It is ourselves. I mean, just to slightly address that critique, I guess, which is that there's a more explicitly a client on this project, which does open up a whole other set of questions. And I think amazingly, the client body is giving the students the remit to take the time and to allow that feedback to happen. So, constantly we're trying to balance that issue of I guess delivering, to some kind of budget, to a real cost requirement, to deliver these things, but also allow the richness of that experimentation to happen, where the hands-on aspect actually comes through. And I suppose it really, there's a critical moment now, and there's new students who have arrived, and there's students who've been around for a year, and that interaction, I guess, it's not just students interacting with material, but students acting within each other that allows that continuity to happen.
Well, I guess, just sum up in a ridiculous way, because we've run out of time, is that I think one of the great beauties of the program, or the programs or the place itself, is that capacity to try and keep things flexible or open, actually as you are making and designing the thing. So it's to continue, it's not in the traditional architectural way of designing, drawing it up, having others make it. It's a dynamism that is ongoing throughout a process, which is a process that isn't just limited to sort of one group of students or one group of occupants, but is a continuity and a form of disruptions over a sort of multi-year period, right from the initiation of the landscape itself through to those products and those buildings that you're producing now, and then in the future, the sort of the other types of manifestations and changes that will occur. So I think it's been a wonderful thing, which can be discussed now following this with the drinks, right? Yeah. Right, so thank you all, and